3 months after laying my only son to rest, I visited the lake house I built for him. The lights were on. I thought it was trespassers. But when I bypassed the changed security gate and checked the hidden cameras I installed years ago, I was shocked by what I saw. The people inside were not strangers, and the conversation I overheard altered everything I thought I knew about my son's death. I am Malcolm Reed, 75 years old, and this is the story of how I destroyed the people who thought they could bury my bloodline and steal my legacy. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light no matter how deep someone tries to hide it. The drive from Chicago to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. I know this because I made the drive in absolute silence. No radio, no music, just the hum of my truck engine and the relentless memories of my son, Andre. It had been exactly 90 days since we lowered him into the ground. A boating accident, the police called it. They said the steering cable snapped on his speedboat, throwing him into the freezing waters. I stood at his grave and watched his widow Chloe weep uncontrollably. She wore a black designer dress and leaned heavily on the shoulder of Trent, my son, business partner. They looked like two people completely broken by tragedy. Chloe had wailed, throwing herself against the casket, screaming that she could not live without him. Trent had patted her back, looking at me with somber eyes, offering his condolences. But tonight, with the cold night air biting against my windshield, I was about to find out that their tragedy was actually a carefully calculated murder. I turned my truck off a quarter-mile down the road from the lake house property. I did not want headlights announcing my arrival. I walked the rest of the way through the crisp Wisconsin night air. Mixing concrete in the brutal Chicago winters for 40 years teaches a man a lot of things. It teaches you how to ignore the cold. It teaches you absolute patience. And most importantly, it teaches you how to spot a crack in a foundation before the whole building collapses. I am a retired structural engineer and construction contractor. I built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing but calloused hands and a relentless work ethic. I built this lake house for Andre as a retreat for him, his wife, and my 10-year-old grandson, Miles. When I reached the main wrought iron gate, I reached out to punch in the family security code. Red light. Access denied. I paused, staring at the glowing red screen. The code had been changed. Just last week, Chloe called me crying hysterically, saying she was too grief-stricken to even think about visiting the lake house. She said the mere thought of looking at the water made her want to die. She said she could not bear to step foot on the property. Yet here I was, standing outside the gate, and I could clearly see the warm glow of the interior lights reflecting off the dark surface of the lake. Someone was inside. And someone had locked me out of the very property I constructed from the ground up. A normal 75-year-old grieving father might have banged on the gate or called the police thinking there were squatters. But I am not an emotional old man. I am a builder, and a builder always leaves a back door. I knelt down by the stone pillar holding the keypad. I pried off the decorative metal plate underneath the primary panel, exposing the raw wiring and a secondary override keypad I installed for the construction crew 5 years ago. I punched in the master sequence, 6 numbers. The heavy iron gate swung open with a quiet mechanical hum. I did not walk up the main driveway. I kept to the tree line, letting the shadows hide my approach. My boots made no sound on the damp grass. I reached the back of the house, heading straight for the basement utility entrance. Chloe never went down there. She hated the basement, complaining about the smell of concrete and pipes. To her, a house was just a backdrop for her expensive lifestyle. She never cared about the pipes, the wires, or the foundation that held it all together. To me, it was a living, breathing machine, and I knew exactly how it operated. I unlocked the heavy steel utility door and slipped inside, letting the darkness swallow me. The basement was cold and silent, but through the thick ceiling joists, I could hear the faint sound of music and laughter coming from the main living room above. It was not the laughter of a grieving widow. It was the sound of a celebration. I stood in the darkness of the utility room, letting my eyes adjust. I remembered the day Andre first introduced me to Chloe. My late wife Vivian had pulled me aside later that evening. Vivian had a gift for reading people. She looked at me and said, "Malcolm, that girl has cold, calculating eyes. She looks at our son the way a shopper looks at a shiny new car." I brushed it off back then, thinking I was just being an overprotective father. Andre was so happy, and I wanted nothing more than to see my son smile. I should have listened to Vivian. Now, standing in the belly of the house I built, I needed to know exactly what was happening above my head. I could have marched up those stairs and demanded answers. I could have kicked the door open and let my anger do the talking. But confronting a problem blindly is how you get crushed under the rubble. You never knock down a load-bearing wall without inspecting the blueprints first. I pulled my tablet from my coat pocket. 5 years ago, when I installed the central heating and air conditioning systems, I embedded high-definition microcameras inside the custom ventilation grills in the living room, the kitchen, and the master bedroom. It was a security measure for times when the house sat empty during the winter. Andre knew about the system. Chloe, the woman who could not be bothered to understand how a thermostat worked, had absolutely no idea. I connected to the local secure network, typed in my credentials, and tapped the icon for the main living room feed. The screen flickered to life in crisp resolution, and what I saw on that screen froze the blood in my veins. The grief-stricken widow who had sobbed on my shoulder at the cemetery was sitting on the plush leather sofa wearing a silk robe, holding a crystal glass of vintage champagne. And sitting right beside her, his arm wrapped intimately around her waist, was Trent, my son, trusted business partner. The white man who had stood at the pulpit and delivered a tearful eulogy calling my son his brother. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. This was not a business meeting. This was not two friends comforting each other in mourning. I turned up the volume on my device, putting the earpiece in. Their voices came through loud and clear. They were laughing. They were drinking the expensive champagne I had gifted Andre for his anniversary. I stood perfectly still in the dark basement, letting the cold reality wash over me. My son had been betrayed in the worst possible way. As I watched them, my mind flashed to my grandson Miles. 10 years old, with my son's smile and my late wife eyes. Miles had been crying himself to sleep every night since his father passed. He asked me why his dad had to leave him. He asked me if the boat was broken, and here was his mother drinking champagne with the man who was supposed to be his Uncle Trent. The rage building inside my chest was a physical weight, a heavy concrete block pressing against my lungs. I wanted to tear the house apart piece by piece, but the thought of Miles kept my feet planted firmly on the cold basement floor. If I acted on impulse, if I let my anger control me, I might end up in a jail cell while these two monsters raised my grandson. That was not an option. I zoomed in on the camera feed, focusing on Trent's face. He looked relaxed, arrogant, completely at home in the house my son had paid for. Chloe leaned into him, her blonde hair falling over his shoulder. She whispered something in his ear and he laughed, throwing his head back. It was a sickening display of absolute betrayal. Every fiber of my being demanded that I march up those wooden stairs and introduce them to the wrath of a father who had nothing left to lose. I took a deep breath, holding the cold air in my lungs until the urge to kill subsided into a cold, calculated focus. I am a builder, I reminded myself. And before you demolish a structure, you have to set the explosive charges in exactly the right places. They thought I was just a tired old man waiting to die. They had no idea I was the architect of their upcoming destruction. 3 months after laying my only son to rest, I visited the lake house I built for him. The lights were on. I thought it was trespassers, but when I bypassed the changed security gate and checked the hidden cameras I installed years ago, I was shocked by what I saw. The people inside were not strangers, and the conversation I overheard altered everything I thought I knew about my son's death. I am Malcolm Reed, 75 years old, and this is the story of how I destroyed the people who thought they could bury my bloodline and steal my legacy. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light, no matter how deep someone tries to hide it. I stood motionless in the freezing utility room of the basement. Above my head, the thick wooden floorboards groaned slightly under the weight of footsteps. Then came the sound that made my stomach turn. It was laughter, high and clear and completely out of place. It was followed by the sharp, unmistakable clink of crystal glasses meeting in a toast. My heart hammered against my ribs. For a fraction of a second, the grief-stricken father inside me wanted to march up those wooden stairs and kick the oak door off its hinges. I wanted to confront whoever was in my son house disrespecting his memory. My hands curled into fists so tight my knuckles ached. I could feel the cold steel of a heavy wrench resting on the workbench right next to me. It would have been so easy to grab it. So easy to let the raw, blind rage take over. But I am not a man who acts on blind rage. I spent 40 years running construction sites across Chicago. I managed crews of rough men and built skyscrapers that touched the clouds. You do not survive in that business by losing your temper. You survive by assessing the structural integrity of a situation before you swing the wrecking ball. I forced myself to breathe. I let go of the wrench. I reached into the inside pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out my tablet. 5 years ago, when I built this lake house for Andre, I wanted to make sure it was secure. I personally designed and installed the central heating and air conditioning systems. While I was running the ductwork, I embedded tiny high-definition cameras deep inside the custom ventilation grills. There was one covering the main living room, one in the kitchen, and one pointing down the main hallway. Andre knew all about the system. We tested it together, laughing about how we felt like secret agents. Chloe, on the other hand, never knew a thing. She was the kind of woman who only cared about the expensive Italian marble countertops and the imported hardwood floors. She never bothered to look up at the ceiling vents. She never cared about the bones of the house. That superficial arrogance was about to be her downfall. I turned the brightness on my screen all the way down. I connected to the local secure network that I had hidden under a dummy network name. My thick fingers tapped the screen, pulling up the master control application. A loading circle spun for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the high-resolution feed from the living room vent flickered to life. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the stone fireplace I had built stone by stone, but the warmth in my chest vanished instantly. Sitting on the plush leather sofa right where my son used to sit was Chloe. She was not wearing the modest mourning clothes she wore to the cemetery. She was wearing a sheer silk robe, her legs draped casually over the lap of a man sitting beside her. And that man was Trent. Trent was Andre's business partner. He was the man who stood at the pulpit during my son's funeral, weeping openly, wiping his eyes with a pristine white handkerchief. He had called Andre his brother. He had hugged my 10-year-old grandson Miles and promised he would always be around to look after the family. Now here he was, lounging in my son's house, pouring another glass of vintage champagne for my daughter-in-law. I stared at the screen, completely paralyzed. The tablet felt incredibly heavy in my hands. I watched Chloe run her fingers through Trent's hair. I watched him lean down and kiss her neck. The sheer audacity of it was sickening. They were not 2 grieving friends seeking comfort in a dark time. They were celebrating. The way they touched, the casual intimacy of their movements, told me everything I needed to know. This was not a new development. This affair had been going on while my son was still alive. They had been making a fool out of Andre right under his nose. A deep physical nausea washed over me. I thought about my grandson Miles, crying himself to sleep every night, asking why his dad had to go to heaven so soon. And right here, just a few hours away, his mother was playing house with the man who claimed to be his Uncle Trent. I pressed the volume button on the side of my tablet, turning up the audio feed from the hidden microphones. The sound was crystal clear, echoing in my earpiece. "You really outdid yourself with the champagne," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet satisfaction. "It is exactly what we need to celebrate." Trent chuckled, a low rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. "Only the best for us, baby," he replied, taking a slow sip from his glass. "We earned it. It has been a very long 3 months playing the grieving best friend. I am getting tired of wearing black suits and looking sad every time someone mentions his name." Chloe sighed, leaning her head back against the sofa. "Tell me about it. Playing the devastated widow is exhausting. If I have to listen to one more of Malcolm's stories about Andre growing up, I am going to lose my mind. The old man is so clueless." "Oh," he looks at me with those sad eyes, completely oblivious. Hearing her mock my grief, hearing her laugh at the pain of a father who just buried his only child, ignited a fire in my soul that burned hotter than any furnace. I gripped the tablet, staring at their smiling faces. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Nothing could have prepared me for the words that would shatter my entire reality and turn my world into a war zone. Trent shifted on the sofa, setting his glass down on the coffee table. He looked at Chloe with a dark, arrogant smirk. "Well, the waiting is almost over," he said. "I have to admit I was worried the water patrol might look too closely at the wreckage, but I did a flawless job." My breath caught in my throat. I stopped moving. I stopped breathing. I pressed the earpiece deeper into my ear, praying to God that I was misinterpreting his words. Chloe traced the rim of her glass with her finger, looking at him with absolute adoration. "You are a genius, Trent," she whispered. He leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head. "I snapped the steering cable exactly where it would look like natural wear and tear," he stated, his voice filled with a chilling pride. I frayed the edges just enough so that when the tension hit maximum capacity out on the open water, it would just give way. The Water Patrol inspector took one look at it and closed the file as a tragic mechanical failure, a terrible tragic accident. He laughed a dry, cruel sound. Andre never stood a chance once that boat hit full speed. The basement around me seemed to spin. The concrete walls felt like they were closing in, crushing my chest. A tragic accident. That is what the police told me. That is what the Coast Guard told me. They said my son lost control of his speedboat when the steering failed, throwing him into the freezing dark waters of the lake. They said it was just a horrible twist of fate. But it was not fate. It was murder. Cold, calculated, premeditated murder. I watched through the screen as Chloe leaned forward, wrapping her arms around the neck of the man who had just confessed to killing her husband. She kissed him deeply, passionately, without a single ounce of remorse. "You did what had to be done," she said, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. "And now, we get the reward. The $5 million life insurance policy clears next week. The company sent the final approval letter today. Once that money hits my account, we put this dump of a lake house on the market. We liquidate everything that belongs to the old man, and we leave for good. $5 million. That was the price tag they put on my son's life. They murdered my boy, the boy I raised, the boy who gave me my beautiful grandson, all for a payout. They planned it together. They executed it flawlessly. And they used my son's funeral as a stage to cover their tracks. I pulled the earpiece out of my ear, letting it hang loose against my chest. The audio was no longer necessary. The truth was burned into my brain forever. I stared at the frozen image of them on my screen. Two monsters drinking champagne over the grave of a good man. A profound, chilling silence settled over me. The initial wave of hot, blinding rage was gone. It had been replaced by something much more dangerous, a cold, absolute clarity. I had spent my entire life building things. I built houses, I built commercial centers, I built a secure life for my family. But standing there in the dark, damp basement of the lake house, I realized my building days were over. It was time for a demolition. If I walked upstairs right now and killed them both, I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. Chloe's wealthy parents would take custody of my grandson, Miles. They would raise him to forget his father. They would raise him to forget me. Trent and Chloe would win even in death. I could not allow that. I needed to destroy them in a way that left them with absolutely nothing. No money, no freedom, no dignity. I wanted them to rot in a concrete cell for the rest of their natural lives, fully aware that the clueless old man they mocked was the one who put them there. I carefully closed the application on my tablet, making sure the cameras remained fully operational and hidden. I slipped the device back into my coat pocket. I looked up at the wooden ceiling one last time, memorizing the sound of their laughter. Let them laugh, I thought to myself. Let them drink their champagne and plan their grand escape. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet won. I turned around and walked quietly back to the heavy steel utility door. I slipped out into the freezing Wisconsin night, locking the door securely behind me. The wind bit at my face, but I did not feel the cold. My mind was already miles ahead, calculating every move, every legal loophole, every trap I was going to set. I walked through the shadows of the tree line back to my truck. I climbed inside the dark cabin and started the engine. As I pulled away from the property, heading back toward the highway to Chicago, the tears finally came. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a father making a silent blood oath to his murdered son. They thought they had buried my bloodline, but they forgot one crucial detail. I am the one who poured the foundation they were standing on, and I knew exactly how to pull it right out from under them. The heavy steel pipe wrench sat on the scarred wooden workbench, illuminated only by the faint silvery glow of the moonlight filtering through the basement egress window. My calloused fingers hovered over the cold, textured grip. I could feel the dense weight of it in my imagination. It was a 24-inch solid iron wrench heavy enough to crack a concrete block, or a human skull. The voices from the living room directly above my head continued to filter down through the aluminum ventilation shaft. Trent was laughing, a deep, arrogant sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Chloe was pouring more of the vintage champagne, the crystal glasses clinking in a cheerful toast to my son's murder. Every chuckle, every clink of glass was a rusty nail being driven violently into my heart. My only son, Andre, was lying in the freezing dark earth of a Chicago cemetery, and the two people directly responsible for putting him there were upstairs celebrating their impending $5 million payday. The raw primal urge to grab that iron wrench, march up the wooden stairs I had built with my own two hands, and kick the living room door off its hinges was nearly overpowering. It would take me less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds of unbridled, justified violence to balance the scales. I could vividly picture the look of absolute terror on Trent's smug face when I walked into the room. I could imagine Chloe dropping her champagne glass, the expensive liquid soaking into the imported hardwood floors as she realized her deadly secret was out. It would be brutal, it would be final, and it would be the easiest thing I had ever done in my 75 years of life. I wrapped my right hand around the cold handle of the wrench. I lifted it off the bench. It felt perfect, familiar, like an extension of my own arm. But as I took my first heavy step toward the staircase, a single crystal-clear image flashed in my mind, stopping me dead in my tracks. It was the face of my 10-year-old grandson, Miles. I remembered the rainy day of Andre's funeral. Miles had clung to my leg, his small shoulders shaking uncontrollably as he wept into my coat, asking me why his daddy could not come home. If I walked up those stairs right now and let my blind rage take the wheel, I would be arrested for double homicide by sunrise. I would spend the rest of my natural life wearing a jumpsuit in a concrete cell in a maximum security state prison. And what would happen to Miles? With his father murdered, his mother dead, and his grandfather locked away in prison, he would become a ward of the state. Or worse, he would be handed over to Chloe's toxic, enabling parents in Oregon. Those people despised Andre from the day he married their daughter. They despised me. They would raise my grandson to forget his father's legacy, to erase his heritage, and to believe that his mother was a tragic victim of a violent old man. I could not let that happen. Miles had already lost his father to greed. I absolutely refused to let him lose his future to my temporary need for vengeance. I slowly lowered the heavy iron wrench back onto the workbench. The soft clink of metal against wood echoed quietly in the damp basement air. Killing them tonight would be far too quick. It would be a mercy they did not deserve. Death is just an instant, but a long life spent rotting in a federal penitentiary, stripped of every stolen dollar, every ounce of false pride, and every shred of freedom that is a true punishment. Chloe and Trent thought they were untouchable because they had fooled the local water patrol. They thought they had successfully secured a $5 million fortune without leaving a single fingerprint. I needed them to feel the absolute peak of that arrogance, the dizzying height of their false victory, before I violently ripped the floorboards out from under them. I needed to meticulously dismantle their lives, brick by brick, document by document, until there was nothing left of them but dust. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the familiar, grounding scent of sawdust and concrete. I pulled the heavy collar of my winter coat up against the basement chill, turned my back on the wooden stairs, and silently slipped out through the steel utility door. The Wisconsin night air hit my face like a sheet of solid ice, but the fire burning inside my chest kept me perfectly warm. I made sure the heavy steel door clicked shut and locked securely behind me, trapping the deadly secrets of that house inside. I kept strictly to the shadows of the tall pine trees, avoiding the glow of the security lights, walking the quarter-mile back to where I had parked my truck on the shoulder of the desolate county road. I did not look back at the brightly lit lake house. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was happening inside, and I knew exactly how it was going to end. I climbed into the cab of my truck, closed the door as quietly as possible, and turned the ignition. The headlights cut through the pitch-black darkness as I pulled onto the highway, pointing the heavy vehicle south toward Chicago. The drive back to the city was a journey of total psychological transformation. When I had driven up to Lake Geneva 3 hours ago, I was a grieving, broken father looking for a quiet moment of connection in the house his deceased son loved. Now, speeding down the empty interstate at 70 miles an hour, I was a master contractor preparing for the largest, most dangerous demolition project of my life. I let my mind work the exact way it always did when faced with a structural collapse on a building site. I analyzed the weak points of their plan. Chloe and Trent thought they had committed the perfect murder by snapping the boat's steering cable and letting the lake do the rest. They were relying entirely on the $5 million life insurance payout to fund their grand escape and their new life together. That money was their entire foundation. But what they did not know was that I held the hidden blueprints to their financial destruction. I reached out and pressed the voice command button on my truck's dashboard. Call Vaughn. I commanded the system. Vaughn was my private attorney, a sharp, ruthless, and incredibly expensive corporate lawyer who had handled my construction firm's complex legal battles for over 20 years. He was the kind of man who did not care what time the clock said when a major client called with an emergency. The phone rang 3 times before his deep, gravelly voice filled the cabin through the Bluetooth speakers. Malcolm Vaughn said, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "Do you know it is 2 in the morning? Is everything all right?" I kept my eyes locked on the dark highway ahead, my grip on the leather steering wheel steady and unforgiving. "Nothing is all right, Vaughn," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and level. "I need you wide awake right now. Grab a pen and a legal pad." I could hear the sudden rustling of bed sheets and the sharp click of a bedside lamp turning on at the other end of the line. "I am listening," he said, the sleep entirely gone from his voice, replaced by sharp professional focus. I took a slow breath and laid out the devastating facts. Andre's boating accident was not an accident, Vaughn. I just left the lake house property in Wisconsin. I have hidden high-definition cameras installed in the ventilation system there. I caught Trent and Chloe on video celebrating in the living room. Trent confessed out loud to cutting the steering cable on the boat. They murdered my son for the $5 million life insurance policy. The silence on the line was absolute and heavy. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of my truck's tires against the cold asphalt. "Good God," Malcolm Vaughn finally whispered, genuine shock bleeding into his words. "I will call the state police right now. We can have them arrested by dawn." "No," I barked sharply, my voice echoing in the cabin. "Do not call the local police. A state murder charge is not enough." A smart, high-priced defense attorney could drag a state trial out for years, claiming the audio was illegally obtained or taken out of context. I do not want them just going to jail for a little while. I want them buried in a federal penitentiary where they will never see the light of day again. I want them to lose the money, the house, and any legal chance of ever seeing my grandson again. We need to build an airtight federal case. "What are you thinking?" Vaughn asked, his tone shifting seamlessly from shock into pure calculating legal strategy. "I want you to let the insurance claim proceed," I told him, gripping the wheel tighter. "Do not block the $5 million payout. Let Chloe file the final paperwork. Let her submit the fraudulent claims across state lines. If she uses the internet or the postal service to file a false insurance claim based on a premeditated murder, she crosses straight into federal jurisdiction. That is wire fraud and mail fraud. We are going to let her dig her own grave, hand her the shovel, and watch her jump right in. Furthermore," I continued, my voice cold as steel, "we need to prepare the blind trust documents for the lake house. Chloe thinks she is going to sell that property the second the insurance money clears. When she tries to put it on the real estate market, we are going to hit her and Trent with a massive federal forgery charge." I could hear Vaughn writing furiously on his end of the line. "Malcolm, this is incredibly dangerous," he warned cautiously. "If we let the insurance payout go through, we have to coordinate directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Insurance Fraud Division. If Chloe transfers that $5 million into an offshore account before we can freeze it, that money could be gone forever. She will not get the chance," I assured him. "I am going to play the role of the frail, grieving, confused father. I am going to give her enough rope to hang herself, and then I am going to kick the chair out from under her. Get in touch with your contacts at the FBI first thing tomorrow morning. Tell them we have a slam-dunk federal case of first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and wire fraud, complete with high-definition video and audio confessions. I will make the calls at sunrise." Vaughn promised, his tone grim and resolute. "Malcolm, I am so incredibly sorry about Andre. I know how much you love that boy." I swallowed hard, forcing the heavy lump of grief in my throat back down into the darkness where I could ignore it. "We will mourn Andre when the work is done, Vaughn. Right now we have a demolition to prepare for." I hung up the phone. The glowing, jagged signs of the Chicago skyline began to emerge on the horizon, cutting brightly through the pitch-black night. The city where I had built my entire empire was waiting for me. Chloe and Trent had made a fatal miscalculation. They had violently destroyed a piece of my heart, but in doing so they had awakened a man who knew exactly how to dismantle their entire existence without leaving a single trace. The silent retreat was over. The war had officially begun. The sun rose slowly over the Chicago skyline, painting the city in harsh shades of cold gray and pale yellow. I had not slept a single minute since returning from the lake house in Wisconsin. I sat in my heavy leather armchair in the silent living room, staring blankly at the wall. My mind was a steel trap processing the audio and video files I had secured on my encrypted tablet. The sound of Trent laughing and Chloe plotting the theft of my son's $5 million life insurance policy looped endlessly in my head. I drank a cup of bitter black coffee, letting the harsh taste ground me in reality. I was a man preparing for a brutal war. But to the outside world, I had to remain a broken 75-year-old father mourning his only child. I had spent the early morning hours reviewing my financial portfolios and securing the blind trust documents. I knew I had to be flawless today. At exactly 9 in the morning, the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly through the quiet house. I slowly stood up, allowing my joints to pop and my shoulders to slump forward. I walked over to the digital security monitor mounted on the hallway wall. Standing on my front porch was the very woman who had orchestrated the murder of my son. Chloe was dressed perfectly for a theatrical performance. She wore a modest dark navy dress with long sleeves and a high collar designed to make her look fragile and conservative. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple, messy knot to show she was too devastated to care about her appearance. She held a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hand. Even through the grainy resolution of the porch camera, I could see that her eyes were artificially red and puffy. She had probably spent the car ride rubbing her eyes raw to simulate a sleepless night of weeping. It was a flawless costume of grief crafted by a sociopath. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing the burning hot rage deep down into the pit of my stomach. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open to let the monster inside. Chloe let out a dramatic, shaky breath the exact moment she saw my face. "Oh, Malcolm," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly on the syllables. She stepped forward immediately and wrapped her thin arms around my neck, burying her face deep into my shoulder. She smelled of expensive vanilla perfume and cold, calculated deceit. I forced my arms to rise and gently pat her back, playing the role of the comforting, vulnerable father-in-law. I closed my eyes, and in that moment of absolute darkness, my mind flashed back 10 years to the day Andre first brought her to this very house. My beautiful late wife, Vivian, had been standing right where I was now. Vivian had cooked a massive roast dinner, welcoming Chloe into our home with open arms and a warm smile. But later that night, while we were washing dishes in the kitchen, Vivian looked at me with a profound, lingering sadness. She told me that Chloe had cold, calculating eyes that never smiled when her mouth did. Vivian said the girl looked around our home, taking mental inventory of our possessions rather than looking at our son with genuine love. I had foolishly dismissed Vivian's worries back then, telling her she was just being a protective mother who did not want to let her boy go. How I wished I could go back in time and listen to the wisdom of the woman who always knew best. Now Vivian was gone and Andre was gone, and I was left holding the woman who took him away. I gently pulled away from Chloe and ushered her slowly into the living room. She walked with a slow, exaggerated limp, as if the immense weight of her fake sorrow was physically crushing her spine. She sat down on the edge of the leather sofa, keeping her hands folded neatly and timidly in her lap. I sat in my armchair across from her, letting my hands tremble slightly on my knees. I asked her what was wrong and why she had driven all the way from Wisconsin so early in the morning. Chloe looked down at her hand, squeezing the crumpled tissue until her knuckles turned a stark white. "Malcolm," she began, her voice barely above a fragile whisper, "I did not want to come here and burden you with this. You have already lost so much, and we both are suffering deeply. But I am absolutely terrified, and I have nowhere else to turn." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, maintaining my frail old man facade. I asked her to please explain what was happening and how I could help. She took a deep, shaky breath and launched into a lie so vile it made the blood in my veins run ice cold. She told me that Andre had been keeping a terrible, dark secret from both of us for over a year. She claimed that his construction supply business was secretly failing and that he had taken out massive hidden loans just to keep the doors open. She looked me right in the eyes and said that Andre had borrowed money from some very dangerous people in the city, unofficial, brutal creditors who operated far outside the boundaries of the law. She claimed that these dangerous men were now coming after her, aggressively demanding immediate repayment for Andre debts. According to her fabricated story, these thugs had threatened her life and warned her that they would take everything she owned if she did not pay them back by the end of the week. I sat there listening to her tarnish the legacy of my hard-working, honest son. Andre was meticulous with his finances and proud of his success. He learned everything he knew about money and ethical business from me. He had a pristine credit score, and his supply business was thriving beautifully. He never took a shady loan in his entire life. But Chloe was sitting comfortably in my living room painting my dead son as a desperate, reckless gambler who had carelessly endangered his family. She was using his tragic death to create a fictional crisis so she could emotionally manipulate me into handing over my assets. It took every single ounce of self-control I possessed not to reach across the wooden coffee table and wrap my hands tightly around her throat. Instead, I widened my eyes, mimicking a look of absolute panic and heartbreak. I asked her exactly how much money Andre owed these dangerous people. Chloe hesitated for a brief moment, letting a single, perfectly timed tear roll slowly down her cheek. She wiped it away delicately with her tissue and looked at me with an expression of pure manufactured desperation. She said the hidden debt was over $800,000. She claimed that Trent had been bravely trying to help her negotiate with the creditors, but they were completely out of time. They demanded the cash by the end of the month, or they would take the business and the lake house. Then she smoothly delivered the true, sinister purpose of her visit. The real reason she had driven all the way from the lake house to Chicago, putting on this elaborate theatrical display. She leaned forward, reaching out to gently touch my knee with her cold hand. "Malcolm," she said softly, her tone dripping with false empathy. "The life insurance policy will not pay out for several months, and I do not have that kind of cash liquid right now. If we do not pay these violent men, they will completely destroy Andre's legacy. They will ruin the family business name, and they might severely hurt me and little Miles. But there is a way we can save his honor and protect the family." She paused, letting the heavy silence stretch to build the dramatic tension in the room. She suggested that I temporarily sign over the deed to my Chicago home to her name. She patiently explained that with the deed in her name, she could immediately take out a massive equity loan against the valuable property to pay off the dangerous creditors today. She promised with a straight face that as soon as the $5 million life insurance money came through, she would pay off the equity loan and transfer the house right back to me. It was a bold, disgusting, and highly transparent attempt to steal my home. She wanted me to hand over the house I had built with my own hands and lived in with Vivian for decades. The sacred house where Andre took his very first steps. She wanted to strip me of my primary residence and leave me completely homeless and at her mercy. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request was breathtaking. She had murdered my son just months ago and was now sitting drinking my coffee, trying to steal the roof over my head. I looked around the quiet room, letting my gaze linger intentionally on the old framed photographs of Andre and Vivian sitting proudly on the mantel. I made absolutely sure Chloe saw the profound sorrow and confusion on my weathered face. I let my shoulders slump even further, playing the part of a defeated old man whose entire world was crumbling into dust around him. I knew exactly what she and Trent were planning to do. If I signed over the deed, they would immediately sell the property or leverage it to the maximum, taking all the cash and leaving me with nothing. They naturally assumed I was a senile, grieving father who would do anything blindly to protect the memory of his son and the safety of his grandson. They thought they had backed me into a tight corner where my boundless love for Andre would be my ultimate downfall. I looked back at Chloe sitting on the sofa. I let a genuine tear form in my eye, fueled by the actual grief I felt for my boy, and let it slide down my cheek. I told her that I could not believe Andre had hidden such a terrible burden from me all this time. I told her that I would do whatever it took to protect her, to protect little Miles, and to keep my son name clean in the city. Chloe's face relaxed almost imperceptibly. A microscopic flash of arrogant triumph sparked in her cold blue eyes. She really believed she had won the jackpot. She reached into her dark leather handbag and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal documents. She said she had brought the preliminary paperwork to start the transfer process today to make things easier for me so I would not have to stress about hiring my own lawyers. I looked down at the stack of papers she placed on the coffee table. I slowly reached out and took them with a deliberately trembling hand. I told her that I needed to read them over carefully before I signed anything because my old eyes were not what they used to be, and legal jargon confused me nowadays. I told her I would review the documents tonight and we could figure out the next steps very soon. Chloe smiled, a gentle, comforting smile that was entirely hollow inside. She thanked me profusely, calling me her savior and the best father a girl could ask for. She stood up, smoothed out her modest dress, and walked out of my house, heading back to her car. She was completely unaware that by handing me those fraudulent documents and spinning that massive lie, she had just handed me the very rope I would soon use to hang her. I sat there looking at the thick stack of papers resting on my solid oak coffee table. They were the fraudulent deed transfer documents. I reached out and picked them up with hands that I intentionally made tremble. I looked up at Chloe and told her that this was a massive decision for a man my age. I told her that my Chicago home was the only thing I had left in this world that I owned free and clear. I reminded her that my late wife Vivian and I had paid off this exact mortgage 30 years ago through back-breaking labor, and that signing it over felt like giving away my entire history. I played the part of a deeply confused and frightened old man clinging desperately to his past. I needed her to push me harder. I needed her to show her true colors completely without any filter. She leaned in closer to me. Her expensive vanilla perfume filled my living room, making the air feel thick and suffocating. She tried to sound soothing, but I could easily hear the sharp, jagged edge of impatience hiding just beneath her sweet voice. She told me that history and memories would not protect us from the highly dangerous men my son supposedly owed money to. She insisted that time was rapidly running out and that we had to act today. When my hesitation continued, she decided to pull the pin on her emotional grenade. Her tone shifted dramatically from a pleading widow to a desperate mother making a harsh, practical choice. She stood up from the sofa and began pacing across my hardwood floor. She stopped, turned to look down at me, and delivered the ultimate ultimatum she knew would tear a normal grandfather apart. She said that if I did not sign the house over to her right this very minute, the violent creditors would seize the lake house and freeze all of her bank accounts. She claimed she would be left completely destitute on the streets. And then came the dagger aimed straight at my heart. She looked right into my eyes and said that if she lost everything, she would have absolutely no choice but to pack up my 10-year-old grandson Miles and move back across the country to live with her parents in Oregon. She let that terrible threat hang in the quiet air of my living room. Oregon, 2,000 miles away from Chicago. She told me that her toxic, enabling parents had already offered to take them in and pay for Miles to go to a private school out there. She said that if they moved, I would probably never see my grandson again because cross-country travel was simply too hard and dangerous for a man of my advanced age. She was using the only living piece of my son I had left in this world as a cheap bargaining chip to steal my house. It was a calculated hostage situation wrapped inside a polite morning conversation. She was leveraging my boundless love for my grandson to rob me blind. The sheer, unadulterated evil of her threat actually took my breath away for a moment. It did not take much acting on my part to let the tears well up in my eyes. The thought of losing Miles, the young boy who carried my last name and my son's exact smile, was genuinely agonizing to consider. But the warm tears that eventually spilled over my cheeks were not tears of defeat or sorrow. They were the physical manifestation of a rage so pure and so highly concentrated that it burned the back of my throat. I buried my face in my large calloused hands. I let my broad shoulders shake violently as if I were falling apart. I let out a broken, heavy sob that sounded like a dying animal surrendering to the end. I played the role of the defeated patriarch, completely shattered by the terrifying prospect of losing his bloodline. Through the gaps in my fingers, I watched her designer shoes standing on my floor. She stepped closer to me. She placed a cold hand on my shaking shoulder. I could feel the arrogant, triumphant energy radiating off her body. She truly thought she had broken the great Malcolm Reed. She thought she had finally stripped away all my defenses and reduced me to a helpless, weeping old fool. I slowly looked up at her, making sure my face was wet with tears and letting my voice crack into a pathetic, frail whisper. I told her I would do it. I told her I would sign whatever documents she needed me to sign because I simply could not bear to lose little Miles. I told her that my grandson was my entire world now, and I would gladly give up the roof over my head to keep him safe and close to me, right here in Chicago. She smiled down at me. It was a sickening smile of absolute, undeniable victory. She immediately reached into her dark leather handbag to grab a pen, ready to force the deed transfer right then and there before I could change my mind. But I held up a shaking hand to stop her. I wiped my eyes with a cotton handkerchief and put on my best confused and highly cautious old man expression. I told her that the manager at my primary bank had known me for 40 years. I explained that if a 75-year-old man suddenly walked into the bank branch and tried to take out a massive equity loan or transfer his property deed to his daughter-in-law, the bank board would immediately suspect elder financial abuse and block the entire transaction. I told her that financial institutions were extremely protective of senior citizens nowadays, and that they would likely call the police to investigate the sudden transfer of wealth. I saw a rapid flash of genuine panic cross her cold blue eyes. She knew I was right. She knew the bank scrutinized large transfers involving the elderly. I quickly offered her the perfect solution. I told her that I needed concrete physical proof to show my bank manager to explain exactly why I was making this drastic move. I told her I needed all the documentation regarding Andre's supposed business debts. I asked for the threatening letters from the creditors, the fake loan agreements, the accounting ledgers she had supposedly found in his office. I told her I needed every single piece of paper related to the debt. I explained that she needed to send me the digital files so I could print them out in very large font for my bad eyes and present them formally to the bank board to justify the urgent equity transfer. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. She was trying to calculate if this was a delay tactic. But her overwhelming greed quickly overpowered her caution. She needed that house, and she believed I was too stupid to understand the documents anyway. She agreed to my request. I told her to email the documents directly to my personal email address before the end of the day so I could go to the bank first thing tomorrow morning. I emphasized the word email, making it sound like the fastest and most convenient way for an old man to receive documents without dealing with the post office. She promised she would gather all the fake creditor letters and send the email as soon as she drove back to the lake house in Wisconsin. She leaned down, kissed my cheek, told me she loved me so much, and walked out my front door feeling like a newly minted millionaire. I sat perfectly still and listened to the sound of her car engine starting. I watched through the front window as her vehicle pulled out of my driveway and disappeared down the Chicago street. The very moment she was completely out of sight, the frail weeping old man routine vanished into thin air. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back and wiping the fake tears from my face. My hands completely stopped shaking. I walked over to my kitchen counter and poured my cold, bitter coffee down the stainless steel sink. Chloe thought she was an absolute genius. She thought she had just manipulated a grieving grandfather out of his multi-million-dollar property, but she was severely uneducated in the realm of federal law. By returning to her lake house in Wisconsin and preparing to email fraudulent financial documents to me in Illinois, she was crossing state lines. The moment she attached those fake debt ledgers and hit the send button on her computer, she would be transmitting fraudulent materials across interstate networks to secure a financial asset. She was about to hand the Federal Bureau of Investigation a textbook, undeniable case of federal wire fraud on a silver platter. Wire fraud carries a massive federal prison sentence, and the beauty of it was that she was generating the digital evidence all by herself. I did not need to hire investigators to dig through her trash or tap her phones. I just needed to open my email inbox, forward her message to my corporate attorney, and let the federal government do the heavy lifting. I walked over to my office desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. I stared at the blank screen, waiting patiently for the notification. I am a builder, and I had just poured the concrete over her feet. Now all I had to do was wait for it to dry. I sat in the heavy leather chair behind my mahogany office desk and stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. The house was completely silent. The kind of deep, suffocating silence that only comes when you are entirely alone with your thoughts and your grief. But I was not going to let the grief paralyze me. I was waiting for a notification. I kept my eyes locked on my email inbox, watching the little digital clock in the corner of the screen tick away the minutes. I have poured thousands of tons of concrete in my lifetime. I know that the most crucial part of any construction job is the waiting. You pour the foundation, and then you have to sit back and let it cure. If you rush it, the whole structure will eventually collapse. If you are patient, it turns into rock-hard stone. I was being patient. Chloe had promised to send me the fabricated proof of my dead son business debts, and I knew her overwhelming greed would not let her delay. Exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes after she drove her expensive car out of my driveway, the notification chime echoed sharply through my quiet office. An email had just arrived in my inbox. The sender name displayed perfectly on the screen. It was from Chloe. The subject line simply read, "Urgent financial documents for the bank transfer." I did not smile, but a cold wave of absolute certainty washed over my chest. I slowly moved the mouse and clicked on the message. There were 4 large digital files attached to the email. I downloaded every single one of them to my encrypted hard drive before I even opened them to look at the contents. I wanted to make sure the digital footprint was permanently secured on my local network, just in case she panicked and tried to unsend the message later. I opened the first document and leaned closer to the screen. It was supposed to be a ledger from Andre Construction Supply Company showing massive deficits and unpaid invoices. I stared at the numbers and I could feel my jaw clench so tight my teeth started to ache. It was a pathetic, sloppy forgery. Andre was a brilliant businessman. I taught him how to balance a ledger when he was 15 years old, sitting right here at this very desk. My boy was meticulous with his spreadsheets. He tracked every single piece of lumber, every pound of cement, and every mile his delivery trucks drove. The document Chloe had manufactured was full of glaring accounting errors and amateur mistakes. She had clearly downloaded a generic invoice template from the internet and hastily typed in random threatening amounts. I opened the second attachment. It was a scanned copy of a fake threatening letter from a fictitious creditor demanding $800,000 immediately. But the third document was the one that truly made the blood boil in my veins. It was a fake promissory note acknowledging the massive debt, and right there at the bottom of the page was a forgery of my son's signature. I reached out and touched the computer screen, running my rough finger over the digital ink. It was a close copy, but it was not his hand. Andre always crossed his letters with a sharp, upward flick. This signature was heavy and hesitant. The sheer disrespect of it was staggering. She had murdered the boy, and now she was sitting in his lake house forging his name to steal the childhood home he grew up in. I took a deep breath, forcing the hot rage back down into my stomach where it belonged. She wanted to insult his legacy, but all she had really done was hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct private line for Vaughn, my corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him that the concrete had just been poured. I told him that Chloe had officially sent the email containing the forged debt ledgers, the fake creditor threats, and the fraudulent promissory note with Andre forged signature. I heard the sound of Vaughn shifting in his leather office chair on the other end of the line. He asked me to confirm exactly where she was when she sent the message. I told him she had driven back to the lake house in Wisconsin immediately after leaving my property in Chicago, Illinois. Vaughn let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He told me that we had her completely dead to rights. He explained the law to me just as we had discussed, but hearing it applied to the physical evidence felt like a massive victory. By sitting in the state of Wisconsin and using an electronic telecommunications network to transmit fabricated financial documents to me in the state of Illinois, with the explicit intent to defraud me out of a highly valuable real estate asset, she had just crossed a massive legal threshold. She had committed textbook federal wire fraud. This was no longer a simple state-level dispute about a house deed. This was a severe federal crime that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I forwarded the entire email exactly as I received it directly to Vaughn's secure server. I told him to make sure the digital footprint, the internet addresses, and the timestamps were perfectly preserved by his forensic team. I wanted zero technical loopholes for her criminal defense lawyer to exploit when the time came. Vaughn assured me that his team was already on it. He told me that he was currently sitting in a secure meeting room with his primary contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal agent had already reviewed the audio and video files I had secured from the hidden ventilation cameras at the lake house. The agent was currently building a massive racketeering and premeditated murder case against Chloe and Trent. Vaughn put the phone on speaker and the federal agent introduced himself. His name was Special Agent Miller, and his voice was completely devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man who hunted monsters for a living. He told me that the wire fraud email was the exact piece of physical corroborating evidence they needed to secure federal arrest warrants. He explained that a video of a confession is powerful, but a video combined with a documented interstate financial crime proves an ongoing criminal conspiracy. Agent Miller told me that they were actively monitoring Chloe and Trent bank accounts, waiting for the $5 million life insurance payout to drop. Once that money moved, the federal trap would snap shut with such force it would break their necks. But then Agent Miller gave me a very serious warning. He told me that criminals like Chloe and Trent do not like to wait. They are driven by extreme greed and profound arrogance. He warned me that because I had played the role of the hesitant, confused old man, Chloe might panic if the bank transfer took too long. She would assume that my bank was blocking the transaction, or that I was too senile to process the paperwork correctly. Agent Miller told me to be prepared for an aggressive escalation. He said that people who are willing to snap a boat steering cable to murder a family member will not hesitate to take drastic measures to silence an old man who is standing in their way. I thanked the federal agent for his time and told him I was completely ready for whatever they decided to throw at me next. I hung up the phone and looked back at my computer screen. I clicked the print button and listened to the rhythmic hum of my laser printer spitting out the forged documents one by one. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and placed them inside a thick manila folder, placing it squarely in the center of my desk. I wanted to have physical copies ready to show them when the time came to look them in the eyes and watch their world burn to ash. I walked away from my office and moved into the kitchen to prepare a simple lunch. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of grief. It was the calm before a massive storm. Agent Miller was absolutely right. Chloe and Trent were not going to sit patiently by the phone waiting for me to call them with good news. They were predators, and predators get restless when their prey does not bleed fast enough. They had already proven they were willing to cross state lines and commit federal fraud. Now they were going to try and remove my ability to fight back altogether. I knew they were going to try and attack my mind. If they could not manipulate me into signing over the house willingly, they would try to prove that I was legally incapable of owning it. They would try to strip away my autonomy, my voice, and my basic human rights. They would try to paint me as a broken, dementia-ridden old fool who belonged in a locked ward. I knew this because I had seen the exact same tactic used by greedy relatives time and time again. They want to steal your wallet, so they tell the world you forgot where you put it. I finished my meal and washed the plate in the sink, moving with deliberate purpose. I went to the living room and checked the tiny hidden camera I had installed inside the spine of a hollowed-out hardcover book on my bookshelf. The small red indicator light was blinking softly, confirming it was recording high-definition video and audio of the entire seating area. If they wanted to play games with my mental health, I was going to give them a performance worthy of a standing ovation. I sat back down in my leather armchair, folding my hands in my lap. I was not a victim waiting to be slaughtered. I was the master contractor inspecting the perimeter, waiting for the thieves to walk through the front door. The concrete of the federal wire fraud charge was already drying perfectly around Chloe's ankles. Now it was time to let her and Trent bring the heavy chains to wrap around their own necks. I closed my eyes and waited for the doorbell to ring. I was ready for the next phase of the demolition. 2 days had passed since Chloe sent the fraudulent email containing the fake debt ledgers. 2 days of absolute silence on my end. I deliberately ignored her follow-up phone calls. I ignored the text messages from Trent asking if the bank transfer had been processed. I wanted them to sweat. In the construction business, when you pour a heavy concrete slab, you watch closely for the stress fractures. When you apply too much pressure too quickly, the weak points always reveal themselves. Chloe and Trent were fracturing. They needed the deed to my Chicago home immediately to secure their fraudulent loans and fund their grand escape. Since I was playing the role of the slow, confused, and grieving old man, they realized they had to force my hand. They could not afford to wait for my grief to run its course. I knew they would escalate the situation. I knew they would send someone to push me over the edge. The doorbell rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I walked over to the digital security monitor mounted on the hallway wall. It was not Chloe standing on my front porch. It was a white man in his late 40s. He was wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. He looked entirely too polished to be a traveling salesman and too nervous to be a casual friend. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward and allowing my hands to develop a slight tremor. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, looking at him with the vacant, tired eyes of a broken father. The man introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Pendleton. He spoke in a soft, overly soothing voice that instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the exact tone of voice people use to speak to a frightened toddler or a stray dog. He claimed he was a specialized grief counselor. He told me that my daughter-in-law Chloe had hired him out of her deep, profound concern for my emotional well-being after losing Andre. I invited him inside, playing the part of the grateful, lonely patriarch who desperately needed someone to talk to. But my eyes missed nothing. I noticed the fine details. His shoes were custom Italian leather. He wore a heavy gold luxury watch on his left wrist. Real grief counselors working for devastated families do not wear $10,000 watches. This man was a hired gun. He was a mercenary in a tailored suit paid to do a dirty job. I led him into my living room, making absolutely sure he sat on the sofa directly in the line of sight of my hidden bookshelf camera. The tiny red indicator light was blinking silently from inside the spine of a hollowed-out hardcover book. The digital trap was set and ready. Dr. Pendleton sat on the edge of the leather cushions, opening his expensive briefcase with a sharp click. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and a heavy silver pen. He started the conversation by asking about Andre. He asked how I was sleeping. He asked if I was eating well and if the house felt too large and empty for me now. I answered him in short, quiet sentences, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. But within 5 short minutes, the direction of his question shifted completely. He stopped asking about my heart and started poking aggressively at my mind. He asked me if I ever forgot where I put my house keys. He asked if I ever felt confused when looking at my bank statements or paying my utility bills. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes cold and calculating. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a counseling session to help a grieving father. This was a psychological evaluation for a medical conservatorship. Chloe and Trent had paid this corrupt psychiatrist to come to my home and officially diagnose me with early-onset dementia or severe cognitive decline. If they could obtain a signed medical affidavit from a licensed doctor declaring me mentally incompetent, Chloe could easily petition the state court to strip me of my legal rights. She would be appointed as my permanent legal guardian. She would take the house, the bank accounts, the retirement funds, and assume total control of my entire life. She would have the power to lock me in a nursing home against my will while she and the man who murdered my son spent my hard-earned fortune. The absolute, unadulterated audacity of their plan was staggering. They had murdered my boy, and now they were paying a crooked doctor to steal my mind. Dr. Pendleton smiled a slick, greasy smile. He told me he just wanted to run a few basic cognitive exercises to check my neurological function. He said it was just a routine procedure to make sure my grief was not affecting my memory. He asked me to state my full legal name and my exact date of birth. I answered him slowly, intentionally, letting my voice waver and crack. Then he asked me what day of the week it was. He asked me to name the current president of the United States. I sat in my armchair, digging my fingernails so deeply into the palms of my hands that I almost drew blood. I had to focus entirely on the physical pain in my hands to stop myself from reaching across the wooden coffee table and breaking his jaw. I am a man who built commercial high-rises from the ground up. I managed complex, multi-million-dollar budgets, read complicated architectural blueprints, and negotiated contracts with the most ruthless union bosses in the city of Chicago. And here was this corrupt, arrogant little man treating me like a helpless infant, asking me to identify the day of the week. I offered him a cup of coffee just to break the suffocating tension in the room. He declined politely. He wanted to get straight back to the business of destroying my autonomy. I listened to his next set of questions. "Malcolm," he said, using my first name with a sickening, unearned familiarity, "can you count backwards from 100 by sevens?" I looked at him. I let the silence stretch out, making the room feel heavy and uncomfortable. I made my eyes look glassy and completely unfocused. I started counting. 100, 93, 86. Then I abruptly stopped. I looked down at the hardwood floor and pretended to completely lose my train of thought. I muttered something about being very tired and confused. Dr. Pendleton wrote furiously on his yellow legal pad. The sharp scratch of his silver pen against the paper was the exact sound of a man forging my medical death warrant. He then asked me to remember 3 simple words: apple, table, coin. He told me he would ask me to repeat those words to him in a few minutes. It was a standard dementia screening test. I knew exactly how it worked because I had watched my own mother decline from real Alzheimer's disease 20 years ago. Using the devastating reality of that terrible disease as a weapon to steal from a grieving father was a level of evil that completely defied human logic. I kept my posture hunched and defeated. I looked down at my calloused hands, rubbing my thumbs together nervously as if I was filled with anxiety. Dr. Pendleton leaned in closer, clearly sensing a massive legal victory. He adopted a deeply patronizing tone. He told me that severe grief can sometimes cloud our judgment and make the world seem overwhelming. He said it was completely normal for men of my advanced age to become confused by complex financial matters like real estate deeds and life insurance payouts. He actually had the nerve to bring up my house. He said Chloe had mentioned to him that I was struggling with the paperwork for a property transfer. He asked if I felt I needed someone to step in and help me manage my daily financial affairs. It was a beautifully wrapped psychological trap. If I said yes, he would document that I openly admitted to needing a legal guardian. If I got angry and yelled at him, he would document that I was erratic, hostile, and emotionally unstable. Both paths led straight to a forced medical conservatorship. I had to walk a very fine wire. I had to give him exactly enough rope to hang himself and Chloe without officially signing away my rights before the federal agents could strike. I looked slightly to the left, making sure my face was perfectly framed by the hidden camera on the bookshelf. The small red light was capturing every single spoken word of this illegal medical consultation. This doctor was risking his medical license, his lucrative career, and his personal freedom for a cash payout from Trent. I wondered exactly how much dirty money they had paid him to walk into my home and diagnose a perfectly healthy man with a degenerative brain disease. Dr. Pendleton smiled again and asked me to repeat the 3 words he had given me earlier: apple, table, coin. I stared at him with a blank, empty expression. I told him I did not remember any words. I told him my head felt cloudy and that I was just so very tired since my son passed away. I let a single heavy tear form in the corner of my eye and roll down my wrinkled cheek. It was never hard to cry when I thought about losing Andre. Pendleton gave me a look of profound fake sympathy. He reached out across the table and patted my knee. He told me not to worry about a thing. He told me that Chloe was a wonderful, caring daughter-in-law who loved me very much and only wanted to make sure I was safe from harm. He said he was going to write up a special medical report that would allow Chloe to take the heavy burden of my finances completely off my shoulders. He was basically confessing to the entire criminal conspiracy right inside my living room, while the hidden microphone recorded every syllable. He packed up his legal pad and placed his silver pen back into his briefcase. He stood up and buttoned his expensive suit jacket, acting like a man who had just closed a highly profitable business deal. He told me he would be in touch with Chloe and that I should just rest my mind. He spoke to me as if I were already a ghost, as if my life was already officially over and my assets were simply waiting to be divided among the scavengers. I walked him to the front door, shuffling my feet heavily across the hardwood floor. I thanked him for coming and thanked him for his kindness. He smiled a greasy, arrogant smile and walked out into the cold Chicago afternoon. I closed the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt. The very moment the lock clicked into place, my hunched shoulders straightened. The false confusion completely vanished from my eyes. I walked back into the living room and looked directly at the bookshelf camera. I had just recorded a licensed medical professional conducting a fraudulent psychiatric exam as part of a massive interstate conspiracy to commit wire fraud and elder abuse. Trent and Chloe thought they were checkmating me. They thought sending this corrupt doctor would speed up their acquisition of my house and my son's life insurance money. But they did not realize they had just handed the federal government another massive felony charge to add to the impending indictment. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of hot black coffee. The demolition was proceeding perfectly on schedule. Dr. Pendleton leaned back in my heavy leather armchair and crossed his legs. He looked at me over the rim of his expensive designer glasses. He told me we were going to do a few more standard tests just to establish a baseline for my cognitive health. I let my jaw go slack. I kept my eyes fixed on the wooden coffee table. Inside my head, I was designing a steel suspension bridge, calculating load stress and wind resistance. Outside, I was a crumbling ruin of a man. I slumped my shoulders forward and let a slight intentional tremor run through my hands. I was giving him exactly what he was being paid to see. He asked me what year it was. I stared at the hardwood floor. I let a full minute pass in absolute silence, making the room feel heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, I looked up at him with wide, vacant eyes. I told him it was 1998. Pendleton smiled a very small, very greedy smile. He wrote something down on his yellow legal pad. The scratching of his silver pen sounded like a rat clawing at the walls. He was sealing my fate on paper. Then he asked me to subtract 7 from 100 and to keep going down. This was the part of the performance that almost made me break character and laugh out loud. For 40 years, I calculated load-bearing stress ratios in my head. I estimated the weight of steel I-beams and massive concrete pours down to the exact decimal point while standing on chaotic, noisy construction sites in the freezing Chicago wind. Now I was sitting in my own quiet living room, pretending I could not subtract a single-digit number. I looked at my trembling hands. I told him 93. Then I stopped. I let my breathing become shallow and erratic. I muttered 80-something. I let my voice trail off into a confused, frightened whisper. I told him my head was just so tired. I asked him if we could stop the test because my brain felt full of thick, dark fog. Pendleton nodded slowly, writing more lies on his legal pad. He pulled a blank piece of paper from his leather briefcase and placed it on the coffee table in front of me. He handed me his heavy silver pen. He asked me to draw a clock face and place the hands at 10 past 11. It is a classic neurological screening tool used to detect severe dementia. I took the pen, holding it clumsily with a weak grip. I drew a lopsided circle that looked more like a crushed egg. I put the numbers in the wrong places, crowding them all on one side of the paper. I drew 3 hands instead of 2, pointing in random directions. I pushed the paper back to him and let out a frustrated sigh. I told him my hands would not do what my brain wanted them to do. He took the paper and looked at it with immense satisfaction. He was looking at his payday. He told me it was perfectly fine and that I should not be frustrated. He said that profound grief does terrible things to an aging mind. He was aggressively patronizing me. He was treating me like a broken, useless machine that needed to be hauled off to the scrapyard. I played right into his filthy hands. I decided to give him the ultimate confirmation he needed for his fraudulent medical report. I looked toward the front window and asked him if my son Andre was coming home soon. I forced my voice to sound desperate and incredibly small. I asked him if Andre was going to bring my little grandson Miles over for Sunday dinner because I had bought his favorite ice cream. Dr. Pendleton looked at me with thick, artificial pity. He softly reminded me that Andre had passed away 3 months ago in a boating accident. I let out a soft, broken cry. I buried my face deep in my calloused hands and let my broad shoulders shake violently. It was the performance of a lifetime. I channeled all the genuine, blinding rage I felt toward this corrupt mercenary and transformed it into the physical manifestation of deep, senile sorrow. If the Academy Awards gave out trophies for playing the fool, I would have swept the entire ceremony. Pendleton packed up his silver pen and his legal pad. He snapped the brass locks on his leather briefcase shut. He stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in his expensive gray suit. He told me to get some rest and drink plenty of water. He said he was going to talk to my daughter-in-law Chloe and arrange for her to take care of all my complicated financial paperwork so I could just relax in my old age. I nodded slowly, keeping my head bowed down in submission. I shuffled to the front door, dragging my heavy boots across the hardwood floor. I opened the door for him. He stepped out onto the porch and told me to have a very good afternoon. I closed the heavy oak door and slid the deadbolt firmly into place. The instant that lock clicked, my entire posture changed. The transformation was immediate and absolute. I stood up completely straight. I rolled my broad shoulders back and took a deep, clean breath of the quiet air in my house. The frail, confused old man vanished into the floorboards. I was Malcolm Reed again. I walked briskly back into the living room, moving with the sharp, lethal purpose of a predator. I went straight to the large oak bookshelf against the far wall. I reached up and pulled out a thick, hollowed-out hardcover book. Inside the hollow compartment was the high-definition, wide-angle camera I had installed the night before. I extracted the camera and connected it directly to my encrypted tablet. I opened the video file to verify the capture. The high-definition footage was absolutely flawless. The audio was crystal clear. The hidden microphone had captured every single patronizing question Pendleton asked. It captured his fake sympathy and his smug, arrogant smiles. Most importantly, it captured him conducting a grossly negligent medical evaluation with the clear, predetermined intent to declare me legally incompetent. This was not just a video recording. It was a devastating federal indictment wrapped in a digital file. Trent and Chloe thought they were quietly buying a medical diagnosis to steal my multi-million-dollar estate. They were actually buying themselves and this corrupt doctor decades in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy to commit elder fraud and medical malpractice. I knew Pendleton would not wait long to deliver the good news to his employers. I walked into my home office and activated the secondary security system. I have a high-resolution surveillance camera mounted above my garage facing the driveway and the street. It is equipped with a military-grade parabolic microphone designed to pick up clear audio from long distances. I installed it years ago when there was a string of aggressive car thefts and property vandalism in my Chicago neighborhood. I pulled up the live external feed on my large desktop monitor. Dr. Pendleton was walking slowly to his luxury sedan parked by the curb. He did not get into the vehicle immediately. He stood on the sidewalk, pulled his cell phone from his tailored suit pocket, and dialed a number. The parabolic microphone locked onto his location and picked up his voice perfectly cutting through the ambient noise of the city street. I put my earpiece in and listened closely. He was talking to Chloe. He told the person on the other end of the line to go ahead with the plan. He said the old man is completely gone. He told Chloe that my mind was absolute mush and that I did not even know what year it was or what city I was living in. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh. It was a cold, cruel sound that echoed through my earpiece. He told her that I was asking when Andre was coming home for dinner. He assured her that he had all the documentation he needed to write a bulletproof medical affidavit. He told her she could file the emergency conservatorship papers at the state courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. He guaranteed that the judge would sign off on the petition immediately based on his expert medical testimony. He ended the call by reminding her to wire the second half of his payment to his offshore account by the end of the week. He opened the door of his expensive car, got inside, and drove away down the street. I stood in my silent home office pulling the earpiece out of my ear. I looked down at the glowing monitor screen. A cold, dark smile spread slowly across my face. It was the first time I had genuinely smiled since the day I found out my son was murdered. They were taking the bait perfectly. The trap was working exactly as I had engineered it. Chloe was going to walk into a state courthouse tomorrow morning. She was going to file fraudulent legal documents based on a bribed psychiatric evaluation in a brazen attempt to steal my entire life's work. She was going to stand in front of a sworn judge and commit blatant perjury. She thought she was securing her financial freedom and her grand escape with Trent. Instead, she was meticulously adding another massive layer of federal crimes to her rapidly growing resume. By attempting to use the court system to defraud an elderly citizen, she was committing fraud upon the court. Every single move she made only tightened the steel noose around her own neck. I sat down at my desk and opened my secure email server. I attached the audio recording from the driveway parabolic microphone. Then I attached the high-definition video file of the fraudulent medical exam from my living room bookshelf. I sent the entire digital package directly to Vaughn, my corporate attorney. I added a short, simple message telling him that the medical trap was officially sprung and that Chloe was heading to the courthouse tomorrow to file the fake papers. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and looked out the window at the city of Chicago. I had built buildings that withstood tornadoes and blizzards. I knew how to design structures that could absorb massive amounts of pressure without breaking. Chloe and Trent had no idea about the immense pressure that was about to come crashing down on their heads. They thought they were the architects of a brilliant, flawless murder and theft. They were just common rats caught in a maze built by a master contractor. The concrete was dry, the steel beams were locked in place. Now all I had to do was wait for them to walk into the final room and shut the door behind themselves. The morning after Dr. Pendleton left my house, I woke up long before the sun. I walked into my kitchen and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. The house was quiet, but my mind was a roaring engine. I had successfully recorded the fraudulent medical exam. Chloe was currently filing false conservatorship papers at the state courthouse. She thought she was building a cage for me. She did not realize she was just gathering the heavy steel bars for her own federal prison cell. But there was one massive piece of the demolition left to secure, the cornerstone of her entire murderous plot. The $5 million life insurance policy. For a brief moment, I thought about calling the insurance fraud division directly. I could have stopped the payment right then and there. I could have frozen the account and starved her out completely. But starving a rat only makes it desperate. I did not want Chloe to be desperate. I wanted her to be completely relaxed. I wanted her to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory right before I took everything away. I walked into my home office and sat at my heavy mahogany desk. I opened a folder containing Andre financial records. I found the direct contact number for his primary life insurance provider. My hand hovered over the telephone receiver. Every single instinct I had as a father screamed at me to stop. Giving $5 million to the woman who orchestrated my son's death felt like a deep and unforgivable betrayal. The $5 million was not just paper to me. It represented every early morning Andre woke up to manage his supply company. It represented the sweat on his brow and the calluses on his hands. He took out that massive policy specifically to ensure that his young son Miles would be taken care of if anything ever happened to him. Andre loved his family with a fierce and profound dedication. To know that his murderers were about to gorge themselves on the very safety net he built for his child was a bitter pill to swallow. I had to mentally detach myself from the emotional weight of that money. I had to view it strictly as a construction material. It was the heavy steel beam required to crush them. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. I navigated the automated system until I was connected to a senior claims adjuster named Richard. I introduced myself as Malcolm Reed, the father of Andre Reed. Richard immediately offered his deepest condolences for the tragic boating accident. I forced my voice to sound tired and completely broken. I told him I was calling on behalf of my daughter-in-law, Chloe. I told him she was too devastated by grief to handle the complicated paperwork and that I wanted to make sure she and my young grandson Miles were financially secure as soon as possible. Richard was incredibly sympathetic. He told me the claim was currently in a mandatory holding period pending a final review by the legal department. I told Richard that I was the secondary beneficiary and the executor of Andrea's estate. I verbally waived all my rights to contest the payout. I urged him to expedite the process, explaining that Chloe was facing severe financial hardship and desperately needed the funds to maintain the family business. Richard promised me he would personally walk the file down to the legal department and push it through the final approval stage. He assured me the $5 million would be wired directly into Chloe's primary bank account within 48 hours. I thanked him profusely, playing the role of the generous, supportive father-in-law to absolute perfection. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. Later that afternoon, I drove downtown to meet with my corporate attorney, Vaughn. His office was on the 40th floor of a massive glass building I had helped construct 20 years ago. I walked into his private suite and sat across from his wide glass desk. Vaughn looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and genuine concern. I told him what I had just done. I told him I expedited the $5 million wire transfer to the woman who murdered my son. Vaughn let out a slow, heavy breath and steepled his fingers together. He told me that most men in my position would have burned the insurance building down before letting that money go through. I looked him dead in the eyes and asked him to explain the legal strategy we had discussed so I could hear it out loud. I needed the cold logic to anchor my mind against the grief. Vaughn leaned forward and laid it out plainly. He said, "Malcolm, if we block that money right now, Chloe is only guilty of attempted insurance fraud. Attempted fraud is a serious crime, but a clever criminal defense lawyer could argue she made a clerical error or was too blinded by grief to understand the paperwork. She could cry in front of a sympathetic state judge, claim she was a desperate mother, and walk away with a gentle plea deal and 5 years of probation. But if we let that money drop into her account, everything changes entirely." Vaughn explained that the moment the $5 million crosses state lines and hits her bank account, the crime is fully executed. It elevates from a state-level attempt to a massive federal felony. She is obtaining money through interstate wire systems based on a premeditated murder. She becomes instantly guilty of first-degree insurance fraud and federal wire fraud. Furthermore, because she and Trent conspired together across state boundaries to commit this murder for financial gain, it triggers federal racketeering charges. Vaughn told me that we are effectively handing her the murder weapon wrapped in a neat financial bow. He said if she only tries to steal the money, she gets a slap on the wrist. If she actually possesses the money based on false claims, we lock her in a concrete box for the rest of her natural life. When Vaughn explained the legal mechanics, he emphasized the absolute finality of the federal justice system. He told me that state prosecutors can be swayed by emotional appeals and crowded dockets. State judges sometimes offer leniency to young mothers with clean records. But the federal system is a completely different machine. It is the slow grinding gears of absolute destruction. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation builds a wire fraud and racketeering case, they do not miss. They do not offer generous plea deals to people who murder family members for financial gain. By pushing the insurance company to release the funds, I was essentially upgrading the weapon used against them from a simple handgun to a guided missile. The $5 million was not a reward for her crime. It was the radioactive bait in a federal mousetrap. I nodded slowly, absorbing the cold, hard facts. I understood the architecture of the trap perfectly. I thanked Vaughn and left his office, taking the private elevator down to the busy Chicago street. The freezing wind whipped against my heavy winter coat, but I felt absolutely nothing. I drove back to my quiet, empty house. I thought about Chloe sitting in the lake house up in Wisconsin. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was refreshing her banking application on her phone every 5 minutes. She was waiting for the zeros to multiply. She was drinking vintage champagne with Trent and laughing about the gullible old man who had just handed over his son legacy. I walked into my living room and stood in front of the large window looking out at the neighborhood. In 48 hours, her phone would buzz with a notification. She would look at the screen and see $5 million deposited into her checking account. She would scream with joy. She would kiss the man who cut my son's steering cable. She would feel an unparalleled rush of absolute invincibility. She would think she was the smartest woman in the world. She would believe she had flawlessly executed the perfect crime. But I knew the truth. That money was highly monitored. Agent Miller from the Federal Bureau of Investigation was watching that specific bank account in real time. Every single digital cent was tagged and tracked by federal authorities. The moment the funds cleared, the federal agents would have all the corroborating physical evidence they needed to secure a grand jury indictment. The net was drawing tighter and tighter around her neck, and she was eagerly pulling the ropes herself. I spent the rest of the evening organizing my home office. I wanted everything in perfect order. I polished the mahogany desk. I filed away the forged debt ledgers and the fake medical reports into a thick, secure binder. I was preparing my house for the aftermath. I knew that after Friday my life would change forever. I would gain full custody of my grandson, Miles. I would have to explain to a 10-year-old boy that his mother was never coming home again. That was the only thought that brought a profound heaviness to my chest. Breaking that innocent boy heart was the collateral damage of this war. But protecting him from a sociopath and a murderer was my ultimate duty as his grandfather. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket, breaking the silence of the room. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from Chloe. It read, "Malcolm Trent, and I will pick you up on Friday morning to go sign the tax paperwork at the notary office. Please have your identification ready, love you." I stared at the glowing text. The final stage was officially set. They were bringing me to a private notary to force the deed transfer of my Chicago home under the guise of routine tax documents. They thought they were bringing a broken, senile old man to the slaughterhouse. I typed a simple reply. "I will be ready. Chloe, see you on Friday." I turned off the phone and placed it on the kitchen counter. I was a master builder, and I had just finished laying the explosive charges at the base of their entire world. On Friday morning, I was going to press the detonator and watch their lives turn to dust. Friday morning arrived with a bitter chill that swept off Lake Michigan. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, preparing my costume for the final act. I chose a gray suit that was one size too large. It made my broad shoulders look sunken and my frame appear fragile. I did not comb my hair with my usual precision. I wanted to look like a man who had completely given up on life, a man who was drowning in grief and confusion. I practiced my trembling hands. I practiced the vacant stare. I was a master builder, and today I was constructing the perfect illusion of a defeated father. At exactly 9 in the morning, a black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled into my driveway. I watched through the front window as Trent parked the car. He did not bother to turn off the engine. Chloe stepped out of the passenger side wearing another modest dark dress. She walked up to my porch and rang the doorbell. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I opened the door and gave her a weak, uncertain smile. She reached out and hugged me, smelling again of that expensive vanilla perfume. She told me how brave I was for doing this today. She said it was just some routine tax forms and estate paperwork that we needed to finalize so the government would not penalize Andre business accounts. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the compliant old fool. I locked my front door and shuffled toward the waiting vehicle. Trent did not get out to open the door for me. He sat in the driver's seat, checking his heavy gold watch, tapping his fingers impatiently on the leather steering wheel. I climbed into the back seat and buckled my seatbelt. The interior of the car smelled of new leather and arrogant confidence. Chloe turned around in her seat and gave me a soft, reassuring smile. She told me that everything was going to be all right and that after today I would not have to worry about a single financial burden ever again. I looked out the window at the passing Chicago streets. I knew exactly what she meant. They were planning to strip me of everything I owned, leaving me completely destitute and legally incompetent. The drive took nearly 40 minutes. We did not go to the gleaming glass towers of downtown Chicago, where legitimate corporate lawyers and estate planners conduct their business. Instead, Trent drove us toward a bleak industrial suburb on the edge of the city. We pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a crumbling strip mall. The buildings were gray and stained with decades of city smog. There was a cheap liquor store, a vacant storefront with boarded-up windows, and a small office with a faded neon sign that read Public Notary and Legal Services. This was not a place where honorable men conducted honest business. This was a dark alley where thieves came to put official stamps on their stolen goods. Trent parked the car and finally stepped out, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He opened my door and offered me a hand with a condescending smirk. He told me to watch my step because the pavement was uneven. I ignored his hand and slowly climbed out of the vehicle, pretending to struggle with my balance. Chloe walked closely beside me, holding my elbow as if she was guiding a blind man. She guided me toward the glass door of the dingy office. I looked at the dirty windows and the cheap vertical blinds. I knew exactly why Trent had chosen this specific location. He needed a corrupt notary public. He needed a man who would turn a blind eye to a highly questionable transaction. He needed someone who would put a state seal on forged documents without asking any inconvenient questions. We stepped inside the office. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. Behind a cluttered metal desk sat a sweaty, nervous man in a wrinkled shirt. He looked up when we entered and exchanged a rapid, knowing glance with Trent. There was no professional greeting. There was no polite introduction. The notary simply wiped his forehead with a tissue and gestured toward 3 plastic chairs arranged around a small conference table in the back of the room. Trent led the way, walking with the swagger of a man who owned the entire world. Chloe gently guided me to the chair and helped me sit down. Trent placed his heavy leather briefcase on the table and popped the brass latches. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents and dropped them loudly in front of me. The stack was easily 2 inches thick. It was a daunting, intimidating mountain of paperwork designed specifically to overwhelm an elderly mind. Chloe sat next to me and leaned in close. She pointed to the top page, which was a standard tax declaration form. She told me that these were just the routine federal and state tax filings for Andre Supply Company. She explained that because I was the executor of the estate, I needed to sign them so the accountants could close the books for the fiscal year. She spoke in that same slow, patronizing tone, keeping her voice soft and sweet. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my reading glasses. I put them on and leaned over the documents. My hands trembled perfectly. I picked up the first page and pretended to read the dense legal jargon with great difficulty. Trent sighed heavily, shifting his weight in his chair. He was growing impatient. He wanted to rush me through the process. He told me I did not need to read every single line. He said his corporate lawyers had already reviewed everything and it was all standard boilerplate language. He told me to just flip to the signature pages and we could all go get a nice lunch to celebrate. But I am a master contractor. I never sign a blueprint without inspecting every single load-bearing wall. I slowly turned the first few pages of tax forms. They were legitimate tax documents acting as a deceptive cover sheet. But as I peeled back the initial layers, I found the rotten foundation they had tried to hide underneath. Buried halfway through the massive stack was a quitclaim deed. I stared at the bold black letters at the top of the page. It was a legally binding document transferring the absolute ownership of my Chicago home, the house I had paid off 30 years ago, directly into Chloe's name. The document stated that I was transferring the property voluntarily and for zero financial consideration. They were stealing the roof over my head. I swallowed hard, maintaining my confused facial expression. I slowly turned a few more pages. The next hidden trap was an irrevocable sale authorization. It gave Trent full power of attorney to liquidate the lake house property in Wisconsin, the exact property that currently sat in a blind trust under my exclusive control. They had drafted documents allowing them to sell the estate and route the profits directly into Trent offshore business accounts. They were trying to steal my son's legacy right out from under me. But the final document hidden at the very bottom of the stack was the one that truly demonstrated the absolute depth of their evil. It was a formal petition for a medical conservatorship. Attached to it was the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation written by Dr. Pendleton. The medical affidavit declared that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and was completely incapable of managing my own financial or personal affairs. The document named Chloe as my permanent legal guardian. By signing that specific page, I would be voluntarily surrendering my basic human rights. I would be giving the woman who murdered my son the legal authority to lock me inside a psychiatric facility and throw away the key. I sat there staring at the papers. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They had orchestrated a flawless ambush. They brought me to a corrupt notary who would gladly testify that I signed everything of my own free will. They hid the lethal documents inside a maze of boring tax forms. They assumed my grief and my advanced age made me an easy target. They assumed I was too blind and too stupid to see the razor-sharp teeth hiding inside the trap. Chloe touched my arm again. She asked me if I was feeling all right because I had been staring at the papers for a long time. She told me we could take a break if my head was hurting. She was playing the caring daughter-in-law to the very last second. But Trent had reached the absolute limit of his patience. He was tired of pretending. The arrogance that had fueled him to murder my son and steal his life insurance policy was now bubbling to the surface. He leaned across the small conference table, invading my personal space. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes. Trent reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. He clicked it open and tossed it onto the stack of fraudulent documents right in front of my trembling hands. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. A dark, cruel smirk spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator who believes the prey is already dead. He looked at me and delivered the final insult. He told me to stop dragging this out. He said, "Just sign on the dotted lines, old man, let us handle the heavy lifting from here." His words hung in the stale air of the shady notary office. "Just sign on the dotted lines, old man, let us handle the heavy lifting." He had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. I had lifted thousands of tons of steel in my life. I had carried the weight of my dying wife and the grief of my murdered son. I looked down at the silver pen resting on top of my own medical death warrant. I felt my heartbeat steady into a calm, slow rhythm. The performance was officially over. It was time to show them what real heavy lifting looked like. I sat staring at the heavy silver pen resting on top of the fraudulent documents. The air in the cramped notary office was thick and stale, smelling of cheap cologne and desperate greed. Trent was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over his tailored suit, waiting for me to sign away my entire life. Chloe was sitting right next to me, holding her breath. I could actually hear the shallow, anxious rhythm of her breathing. She was so incredibly close to the finish line. She could practically taste the millions of dollars she thought she was about to steal. The corrupt notary public wiped his sweating forehead with a tissue, keeping his eyes glued to the desk. He knew he was about to facilitate a massive crime, and he just wanted it to be over. I slowly reached out and picked up the silver pen. It felt cold and heavy in my hand. For the last 3 months, I had played the role of the broken, grieving father. I had hunched my shoulders. I had let my voice crack. I had allowed my hands to shake. I had swallowed my pride and let these 2 murderers treat me like a senile, helpless fool. I did it all for my son, Andre. I did it for my grandson, Miles. I endured the ultimate disrespect so that I could build an airtight cage around the people who destroyed my family. But as my fingers wrapped tightly around the smooth metal of the pen, I knew the performance had officially reached its final second. I held the pen, hovering the tip just an inch above the signature line of the medical conservatorship petition. Chloe leaned in closer, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. She whispered to me, telling me to just sign the paper. Her voice was dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. She promised me it would all be over soon and I could finally rest. I looked down at the paper and then I took a deep, slow breath. The time for pretending was over. I stopped the artificial tremor in my right hand. I locked my muscles and let my hand become as steady as a block of solid concrete. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly into her eyes. The fake cloud of confusion that I had kept in my gaze for weeks vanished entirely. My eyes turned hard cold and completely lethal. I saw the exact moment the realization hit her. The fake, comforting smile on her face began to falter. Her brow furrowed in sudden, profound confusion. She looked down at my perfectly steady hand holding the pen and then back up at my face. The fragile old man she thought she was manipulating was gone. I slowly straightened my spine. I pushed my broad shoulders back against the chair, shedding the hunched and defeated posture I had carried for months. I expanded my chest and sat up to my full height. The physical transformation was absolute and undeniable. I was no longer the grieving victim. I was the master contractor inspecting a demolition site. I shifted my gaze away from Chloe and looked across the small conference table directly at Trent. He was still wearing that smug, arrogant smirk, but it was beginning to crack around the edges. He sensed the sudden shift in the atmosphere of the room. Predators always know when the wind changes direction. He sat up slightly, uncrossing his arms. He asked me what the holdup was. His voice was losing its confident swagger and turning into a nervous bark. He told me to just sign the papers so we could get out of this depressing office. I stared at him with a level of focused hatred that could have melted solid steel. This was the man who cut the steering cable on my sunboat. This was the man who drank my vintage champagne and laughed about my son drowning in the freezing dark water of the lake. I let the silence stretch out, making the cramped room feel incredibly small and suffocating. The corrupt notary swallowed hard, looking back and forth between me and Trent. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Trent opened his mouth to speak again, but I did not give him the chance. I held the heavy silver pen up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the cheap fluorescent light of the office reflect off the polished metal. I looked Trent dead in the eyes, and then I simply opened my fingers. I dropped the pen. It fell and hit the glass top of the conference table with a sharp, loud clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The sound made Chloe physically jump in her seat. Trent stared at the pen rolling across the glass and then glared at me with sudden, intense anger. He demanded to know what I was doing, his face flushing an angry shade of red. I drew a deep breath, expanding my lungs fully. When I spoke, I did not use the frail, whispering voice of a broken old man. I used the booming, commanding baritone voice that I had used for 40 years to shout orders over the roaring engines of cement mixers and heavy cranes on massive Chicago construction sites. I told him I do not think I will. The sheer volume and absolute authority in my voice hit them like a physical shockwave. The words vibrated off the walls of the tiny office. Chloe gasped, shrinking back into her chair as if she had been physically struck. The corrupt notary actually pushed his rolling chair away from the desk, his eyes wide with sudden panic. Trent opened his mouth to yell at me to demand that I pick up the pen and sign the papers, but before he could form a single word, the trap I had built finally snapped shut. The heavy wooden doors of the notary office did not just open, they were shoved open with extreme forceful violence. The door hit the interior wall with a massive crash that rattled the cheap blinds hanging in the windows. The corrupt notary let out a high-pitched yelp of terror and raised his hands above his head. Trent spun around in his chair, his face draining of all color. Chloe screamed and grabbed the edge of the table, her fingernails digging into the wood. Striding through the doorway with absolute purpose was my corporate attorney, Vaughn. He was wearing an immaculate dark suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked like an apex predator entering a cage full of trapped rats. But Vaughn was not alone. Walking closely behind him was a tall, severe-looking woman wearing a sharp blazer and a credential badge hanging around her neck. She was the lead investigator for the National Insurance Fraud Division. And flanking them, both taking up the entire doorway, were two large, physically imposing men wearing tactical vests. The bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were printed boldly across their chests. The federal agents stepped into the dingy office with their hands resting casually near their holstered weapons. Their presence instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence that followed the breach was heavy and absolute. Trent sat frozen in his chair, his arrogant smirk completely erased. It was replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the federal agents, and then he slowly turned his head to look back at me. The realization was hitting him like a speeding freight train. He finally understood that he had not been leading an old man to the slaughterhouse. He had been blindly following a trail of breadcrumbs straight into a federal penitentiary. Chloe was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at the agents. She looked at me, her eyes wide with panic and absolute confusion. She whispered my name, her voice trembling violently. She asked me what was happening and who these people were. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Trent, watching the absolute destruction of his ego. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, resting my steady hands on the table. Vaughn walked over and stood directly behind my right shoulder, presenting a united and impenetrable front. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his boots sounding heavy on the cheap floor. He looked at Trent, and then he looked at Chloe. The agent announced that they were executing a federal warrant for the immediate seizure of all documents and digital devices on the premises. He ordered everyone to keep their hands visible and remain seated. The corrupt notary was shaking so badly he looked like he might pass out. I sat calmly in the center of the storm I had meticulously engineered. I was the architect of this exact moment. I had poured the concrete around their feet. I had built the walls around them, and now the roof was caving in exactly as I had designed it. I watched the color completely drain from Chloe's face as the female insurance fraud investigator stepped up to the table. The investigator placed her hand firmly over the massive stack of fraudulent documents securing the evidence. Chloe looked frantically between the investigator and the armed agents, her mind desperately trying to process how her brilliant plan had unraveled in a matter of seconds. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and spin another web of lies, but her voice failed her. Trent was completely paralyzed. His eyes darted toward the exit, but the large agent blocking the door shifted his weight, making it abundantly clear that any sudden movement would be met with overwhelming physical force. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my heart. The agonizing weight of the last 3 months began to lift from my broad shoulders. I had made a silent promise to Andre while standing in that dark basement at the lake house. I promised him that the people who took his life would lose everything they held dear. Looking at the terrified, shattered expressions on their faces, I knew I had delivered on that promise. I did not need a heavy iron wrench to break them. I had used the law. I had used their own boundless greed. I had weaponized their arrogance and built a trap they could not see until the steel bars slammed shut. I took a slow, deep breath of the stale office air. To me, it smelled like absolute victory. The room was absolutely frozen in time. The federal agents moved with a terrifying, silent precision. One of the agents stepped forward and placed his large hand firmly over the massive stack of fraudulent documents securing the evidence. Chloe finally managed to find her voice. She gasped loudly, bringing her trembling hands up to her chest. She looked at the armed agents with wide, tear-filled eyes, desperately trying to play the role of the terrified, innocent victim. She stammered, asking what was happening and why these people were interrupting our private family business. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told the federal agents that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. She said my father-in-law is very unwell. She claimed I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and that she was just trying to help me manage my complicated estate before I completely lost my mind. I sat perfectly still watching her perform. It was a pathetic display. She was like a desperate contractor trying to patch a collapsing roof with cheap paper tape. Trent was completely paralyzed in his chair. A thick bead of sweat rolled down the side of his pale face. The corrupt notary public was pressed so far back into his chair he looked like he was trying to melt into the cheap drywall behind him. Nobody bought her act. The federal agents did not even blink. My corporate attorney Vaughn stood beside my chair like a column of solid steel. He did not look at her with an ounce of pity. He opened his immaculate leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp folder. He placed it on the glass table right next to the fraudulent papers Trent had brought. Vaughn spoke with the calm, chilling authority of a man who held all the winning cards. He told Chloe that her performance was no longer necessary. He stated that we were fully aware of her plans to liquidate the lake house property in Wisconsin and route the stolen funds into an offshore account. Chloe tried to double down on her lie. She puffed out her chest and raised her chin, trying to summon a false sense of righteous indignation. She stated that she was Andre's legal widow. She claimed that upon my son's tragic death, she automatically inherited all of his assets, including the lake house. She said it was her absolute legal right to sell the property to pay off the massive business debts Andre had secretly accumulated. She looked at the federal agents, hoping to find a sympathetic audience. She told them she was just a desperate single mother trying to provide a safe future for her 10-year-old son, Miles. I leaned forward, resting my large, calloused hands flat on the glass table. I looked her dead in the eyes, and I finally spoke. I told her that she was a terrible architect because she never bothered to check the original blueprints. I told her that she assumed Andre owned the lake house simply because he lived there and paid the monthly utility bills. I watched her face closely as I explained the concept of a blind trust. I told her that 10 years ago, when I poured the very first concrete foundation for that property, I placed the entire estate into a highly secure blind trust. I was the sole grantor and the absolute sole beneficiary of that trust. Andre was only granted a lifetime estate. I explained it to her very slowly so her greedy mind could process the devastation. That meant my son had the legal right to live in the house for the duration of his natural life. But the very second his heart stopped beating, his living rights evaporated completely. The property automatically reverted back to my exclusive legal control. The color began to drain rapidly from her face. I told her that Andre never owned a single brick, a single piece of wood, or a single blade of grass on that Wisconsin property. Therefore, as his widow, she inherited absolutely nothing related to that house. She did not own the lake house. I owned the lake house. I built it, and I owned every single inch of it. I watched her mouth open and close as she tried to form a response, but no words came out. The absolute certainty of her wealth was crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes. She had murdered my son to inherit an empire, but she had inherited empty air. She had spent months plotting to steal a fortune that was legally impenetrable. Vaughn took over the explanation, his deep voice echoing in the small office. He reached into his folder and slid the true property deed across the glass table. It stopped right in front of Chloe's hands. Vaughn explained that because she and Trent had actively drafted legal documents to sell a multi-million-dollar property that they did not legally own, they had crossed a massive legal boundary. By hiring a corrupt notary to authorize the sale of an asset belonging to a federally protected blind trust, they had committed severe documented federal forgery. Furthermore, because they fully intended to use the interstate banking system to transfer the stolen real estate profits, they had compounded their crimes with attempted wire fraud and massive real estate fraud. Trent finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, high-pitched whine. The arrogant swagger he had displayed just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. He tried to throw Chloe under the bus to save himself. He pointed a shaking finger at her and said she told him she owned the house free and clear. He claimed he was just a helpful friend trying to assist a grieving widow navigate a complex real estate market. He said he had no idea the house belonged to a blind trust, and he begged the agents to believe he was an innocent bystander. The lead federal agent stepped forward and told Trent to save his breath. The agent explained that they had already reviewed the high-definition audio and video recordings from the hidden cameras inside the lake house ventilation system. The agent told him they heard him openly bragging about cutting the steering cable on the boat. They heard him laughing about liquidating the dump and leaving the country with his dead partner wife. Trent looked like he was going to be sick. He slumped forward, resting his heavy head in his hands, realizing there was no escape. Chloe was shaking violently now. This was not a fake tremor to gain sympathy from an old man. This was the raw, uncontrollable shaking of a predator that had just realized it was caught in an inescapable steel trap. She looked at the deed on the table, and then she looked back at me. I sat perfectly still, projecting absolute, unyielding strength. I told her that people like her always make the same fatal mistake. They look at a beautiful building and they only see the expensive paint and the shiny windows. They never bother to look at the deep foundation. They never respect the quiet, unseen structural integrity that holds the entire building together against the storm. I told her that I built my wealth the absolute hard way. I did not inherit it, and I certainly did not steal it. I worked in the freezing Chicago wind and the burning summer heat for 40 years to secure a permanent financial future for my bloodline. I protected my assets with the exact same meticulous care I used to design massive commercial skyscrapers. I told her she thought she could just walk in and dismantle my life with a few forged signatures and a corrupt, greedy doctor. I told her she underestimated me from the very beginning. She thought I was just an ignorant old man waiting to fade away and die. She did not realize I was the master contractor who poured the very concrete she was standing on. The female insurance fraud investigator spoke up next. She looked at Chloe with an expression of pure professional disgust. She told her that the fake debt ledgers she had emailed across state lines were already sitting heavily on a federal prosecutor desk. The investigator explained that the federal government does not take kindly to people who use the postal service and electronic networks to steal homes from the elderly grieving parents of murder victims. Chloe let out a long, desperate wail. It was the horrible sound of her entire reality breaking apart piece by piece. She realized that she was not going to walk out of this dingy office and go back to her luxurious, comfortable lifestyle. She realized she was going to leave this office wearing heavy steel handcuffs. I looked over at the corrupt notary public. He was silently weeping, wiping his eyes with his trembling, sweaty hands. He knew his career was permanently over and his freedom was completely gone. I felt absolutely no pity for any of them. They had conspired in cold blood to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my basic human freedom. They had violently murdered the boy I raised from birth. I leaned back comfortably in my leather chair and watched the federal agents prepare their physical restraints. I had successfully delivered the first massive blow. The blind trust revelation had completely destroyed their elaborate real estate scheme. But the absolute finality of their punishment was still to come. I had one more devastating card left to play regarding the $5 million life insurance policy. I sat quietly in the sterile office, breathing in the scent of their absolute defeat. The demolition was proceeding flawlessly, and the final walls were about to come crashing down. The heavy silence in the cramped notary office was suddenly broken by the sound of Trent shifting his weight. Despite the devastating revelation about the blind trust, Trent still thought he could bully his way out of the room. He was a man who had spent his entire life hiding behind expensive suits and aggressive corporate intimidation. He wrongly assumed that the federal agents standing in the doorway were only here for a white-collar real estate dispute. He thought he could hire a high-priced defense attorney, claim it was all a simple misunderstanding over property deeds, and walk away a free man. I watched him try to reconstruct his shattered ego. He stood up from the cheap plastic chair and violently smoothed the wrinkles out of his tailored suit jacket. He puffed out his chest, trying to look physically imposing. Trent looked directly at the lead federal agent and raised his voice. He demanded that the agents leave the office immediately. He stated with complete arrogance that this was a private family matter and a civil dispute over property laws. He pointed a shaking finger at my corporate attorney Vaughn and accused him of manipulating a grieving old man. Trent had the absolute audacity to claim that I was suffering from severe mental decline and that his only intention was to help Chloe secure her rightful inheritance. He spoke rapidly, trying to fill the room with his aggressive corporate jargon. He told the agents they had no warrant and no right to intimidate a grieving widow and her supportive business partner. I sat perfectly still in my chair and watched him dig his own grave. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice to argue. When you set a demolition charge, you do not stand in front of the building and yell at the concrete. You simply step back and press the detonator. The lead federal agent, whose name was Miller, did not even blink. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not raise his voice to match Trent. He simply stared at Trent with eyes that were as cold and dead as winter ice. Agent Miller had hunted human traffickers and cartel bosses. A panicked white-collar criminal in a tailored suit was absolutely nothing to him. Agent Miller let Trent finish his frantic, arrogant speech. When Trent finally ran out of breath and stood panting in the middle of the room, Agent Miller slowly reached down into his heavy black tactical bag. He pulled out a sleek silver laptop computer. He walked forward with deliberate, measured steps and placed the device squarely in the center of the glass conference table. He opened the screen and pressed a single button on the keyboard. He did not say a word about warrants or civil disputes. He simply turned the laptop around so the bright screen was facing directly toward Trent and Chloe. I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I leaned back in my leather chair and rested my hands on my knees. I knew exactly what was on the hard drive of that computer. I was the master contractor who had installed the high-definition cameras deep inside the ventilation shafts of the lake house. I had captured the footage myself. I had sent the digital files to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now I was going to sit back and watch my masterpiece play out in real time. Agent Miller reached over and tapped the spacebar to initiate the video playback. He turned the volume speakers all the way up. The screen flickered to life in crystal-clear 4,000-pixel resolution. The dingy cigarette-stained walls of the notary office were suddenly illuminated by the warm digital glow of the lake house fireplace on the screen. Chloe gasped the moment the video started playing. She recognized her own living room immediately. She saw herself on the screen sitting comfortably on the plush leather sofa. She saw that she was wearing her sheer silk robe holding a crystal glass of expensive vintage champagne. And right beside her, with his arm wrapped intimately around her waist, was Trent. The audio kicked in, filling the small, cramped notary office with incredible clarity. The hidden microphones I had installed were highly sensitive and picked up every single whisper. The sound of Trent laughing on the video echoed off the walls. It was a dark, cruel sound that made the air in the room feel instantly poisonous. Trent stared at the laptop screen, completely frozen. The aggressive tough guy posture he had tried to project just a minute ago vanished into thin air. His mouth dropped open slightly. He watched his digital self lean back on the sofa and take a slow sip of champagne. Then the damning words began. The recorded voice of Trent spoke clearly through the laptop speakers. I snapped the steering cable exactly where it would look like natural wear and tear. The words were loud and undeniable. I frayed the edges just enough so that when the tension hit maximum capacity out on the open water, it would just give way. The Water Patrol inspector took one look at it and closed the file as a tragic mechanical failure. I watched Trent face as he listened to his own voice confessing to the premeditated murder of my son. He could not deny it. He could not claim it was taken out of context. He had clearly detailed the exact mechanical sabotage he used to send my boy into the freezing dark waters of the lake. He had bragged about fooling the authorities. He had smiled while discussing the death of a man who called him a brother. The video continued to play relentlessly. On the screen, Chloe leaned forward, wrapping her arms around Trent's neck, and kissed him deeply. Then her voice echoed through the notary office, dripping with a sickening, sweet satisfaction. The $5 million life insurance policy clears next week. The company sent the final approval letter today. Once that money hits my account, we put this dump of a lake house on the market. We liquidate everything that belongs to the old man and we leave for good. The video stopped and the screen went black. The silence that fell over the notary office was the heaviest and most terrifying silence I had ever experienced in my 75 years of life. It was the absolute silence of complete and total destruction. I looked directly at Chloe. The physical transformation she underwent in that single moment was something I will never forget. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of dirty chalk. Her eyes were wide and frantic, darting wildly from the black laptop screen to the armed federal agents and then finally resting on me. She looked like a ghost. She had spent the last 3 months playing the role of the devastated, grieving widow. She had cried at the cemetery and demanded sympathy from everyone around her. Now her perfectly crafted mask had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotting, greedy monster hiding underneath. She opened her mouth, trying to pull air into her lungs, but she was hyperventilating so badly she could not form a single word. She realized in a blinding flash of horror that I had known the truth the entire time. She realized that every time I had offered her a comforting hug, I knew she was a murderer. She realized that my frail, confused old man routine was nothing but a trap designed to gather enough evidence to lock her in a cage for the rest of her life. She brought her shaking hands up to her face and let out a low, agonizing moan. I turned my gaze to Trent. The smug, arrogant smirk he had worn since the day I met him had entirely collapsed into a mask of pure, paralyzing terror. His eyes were locked on the laptop screen as if he expected the video to start playing again and tell him it was all a bad dream. He began to shake violently. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform waiting to be issued. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs completely failed him and he stumbled against the edge of the conference table. He knew exactly what this meant. There is no high-priced defense attorney in the country who can argue against a crystal-clear, high-definition video confession of premeditated murder combined with federal insurance fraud. He had proudly bragged about cutting the steering cable. He had outlined the exact motive for the crime. He had implicated himself and Chloe in a massive conspiracy that crossed state lines. The steel trap had firmly and violently snapped shut. There was absolutely no escaping this. They could not bribe their way out. They could not manipulate their way out. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had them backed into an airtight corner with zero avenues of retreat. I sat back in my chair and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I did not yell at them. I did not curse at them. I simply watched them break under the crushing weight of their own arrogance. I am a builder, and I had just overseen the most flawless demolition of my entire career. The rotten structure they had built was completely leveled to the ground, leaving absolutely nothing but dust. The video on the laptop screen faded to black, but the silence in the cramped notary office was instantly shattered by the sound of pure animal panic. Trent had spent his entire adult life hiding behind expensive tailored suits and corporate intimidation. He was a man who engineered the murder of my son from the shadows, cutting a steering cable and letting the deep waters of the lake do his dirty work. He was a coward. And when cowards realize they are completely trapped, they do not stand their ground. They run. I watched his eyes dart wildly around the small room. He looked at the heavy glass table. He looked at the blank laptop screen, and then he locked his gaze on the wooden door leading out to the parking lot. His mind was short-circuiting. He actually thought he could outrun the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He shoved his plastic chair backward with such violent force that it tipped over and crashed loudly against the cheap drywall. Trent lunged for the exit. He scrambled past the desk of the trembling notary public, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the thin carpet. He was breathing heavily, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sound of absolute terror. But he did not even make it 3 steps. The federal agents standing in the doorway had been waiting for exactly this reaction. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated speed that comes from years of tactical training. The largest agent stepped forward and met Trent head-on. The agent did not simply block the path. He drove his heavy shoulder directly into Trent's chest. The impact was brutal and absolute. The air was forcefully expelled from Trent's lungs in a loud, ragged gasp. The agent grabbed the lapels of Trent's expensive suit and violently swept his legs out from under him. Trent hit the floor with a sickening thud. The agent drove him face first into the dirty, stained carpet of the notary office. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair watching the physical destruction of the man who thought he could murder my bloodline. The agent planted his heavy, tactical boot squarely between Trent's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground. Trent tried to thrash around, trying to push himself up with his arms, but a second federal agent dropped down and grabbed his wrists. The agent twisted Trent's arms painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the small room. It was the absolute most beautiful sound I had heard in 3 months. It was the sound of justice finally closing its jaws. Trent lay on the floor, pressing his bleeding face into the cheap carpet. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the reality of his new life settled over him. He was no longer a wealthy, arrogant businessman. He was a federal prisoner who was never going to see the outside of a concrete cell again. While Trent was being subdued on the floor, Chloe completely lost whatever remained of her fractured mind. She had watched her grand escape plan collapse into dust, and now she was watching her partner in murder being brutally handcuffed. The shock wore off and was instantly replaced by a toxic, blinding hysteria. She jumped up from her chair, her modest, dark mourning dress wrinkling around her shaking knees. She began to scream at the top of her lungs. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. She pointed her trembling fingers at the federal agents and screamed that they could not do this to her. She demanded that they unhand him immediately. She puffed out her chest and yelled that she was Andre's legal wife. She screamed that she was a grieving widow and a single mother. She frantically looked at the female insurance fraud investigator standing near the table and demanded her $5 million. She yelled that the money was legally hers and that she had every right to take it and leave the state. She was completely delusional. Her greedy, sociopathic brain simply refused to accept that she had been utterly defeated. She genuinely believed that if she screamed loud enough and played the victim hard enough, she could somehow manipulate her way out of a federal murder indictment. Chloe tried to deploy her ultimate weapon, the weapon she had used for years to manipulate my son and deceive my friends. She started to cry. But these were not the quiet, calculated tears she had shed on my front porch when she begged me for my house deed. These were frantic, desperate tears of a cornered predator. She sobbed loudly, letting the mascara run down her pale cheeks. She took a step toward Agent Miller, clasping her hands together in a pleading gesture. She begged him to understand that she was innocent. She lied right to his face, claiming that Trent had forced her to go along with the plan. She cried that she was just a frightened woman who was trying to protect her young son from a violent man. It was a pathetic, disgusting performance. She was throwing the man she had just kissed on video straight under the bus, hoping the federal agents would feel sorry for her. But Agent Miller did not even blink. He looked at her with an expression of pure professional disgust. He did not offer her a tissue. He did not offer her a word of comfort. He simply reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He stepped toward her, his presence completely overwhelming her frantic performance. Chloe backed away, bumping into the edge of the glass conference table. She shook her head wildly, sobbing and pleading for them to stop. The female insurance fraud investigator stepped up beside Agent Miller. The investigator looked Chloe dead in the eyes and began to speak in a loud, clear voice that cut completely through the hysterical screaming. She informed Chloe that she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder wire fraud and federal insurance fraud. As the investigator spoke, Agent Miller grabbed Chloe's wrists. She tried to pull away, she tried to thrash and fight back, but she was completely powerless against him. He twisted her arms behind her back with swift, efficient force. The second pair of handcuffs clicked shut, locking her wrists tightly together. She let out a long, agonizing wail that vibrated off the walls of the tiny office. The investigator continued speaking loudly over the screaming, formally reciting the Miranda rights. She told Chloe that she had the right to remain silent. She told her that anything she said could and would be used against her in a court of law. Every single word was a heavy brick being laid in the wall of her permanent prison cell. The corrupt notary public was cowering behind his metal desk, openly weeping. He knew the federal agents would be coming for him next. He had tried to facilitate the theft of my entire estate, and now he was going to lose his business, his license, and his freedom. My corporate attorney, Vaughn, stood silently by my side. He watched the arrests with a calm, satisfied expression. We had worked tirelessly to build this exact moment. We had gathered the evidence, laid the traps, and expedited the insurance payout to ensure these federal charges would stick permanently. The demolition was a complete and total success. I sat in my leather chair and watched Chloe struggle against the federal agent. Her pristine facade was entirely destroyed. She was a messy, sobbing wreck of a human being. The woman who had drank vintage champagne and laughed about my son drowning was now begging for mercy from people who had absolutely none to give. I slowly placed my hands on the armrests of my chair and pushed myself up to a standing position. I smoothed the front of my oversized gray suit. I no longer needed to pretend to be weak. I stood up to my full height, pulling my broad shoulders back and expanding my chest. The commanding presence of the master contractor returned in full force. I walked slowly around the edge of the glass conference table. My heavy boots made slow, deliberate sounds on the cheap carpet. I walked right past Trent, who was still pinned face down on the floor, groaning in pain. I did not even look at him. He was already garbage waiting to be taken to the landfill. I walked directly over to where Agent Miller was holding Chloe. I stopped just 2 feet in front of her. Chloe looked up at me. Her face was streaked with black makeup and tears. She saw the absolute coldness in my eyes, and she tried one last desperate tactic. She looked at me and sobbed, calling me Dad. She begged me to tell them to stop. She cried that she was the mother of my grandson, Miles. She told me that Miles needed his mother, and that if I let them take her away, I would be destroying his life. She tried to use my boundless love for that 10-year-old boy as a shield to protect herself from the consequences of her own murderous greed. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, concentrated disdain. I thought about the hidden video footage. I thought about the forged signature on the fake debt ledgers. I thought about her threatening to move my grandson to Oregon if I did not sign over the deed to my Chicago home. She was a monster who had disguised herself as a grieving widow. I let the silence stretch out, making sure she felt the full, crushing weight of my presence. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low but incredibly firm. The booming shout was no longer necessary. The quiet, lethal tone of absolute certainty was far more devastating. I looked her right in the eyes and I told her that she was not a widow. I told her that she lost the right to use that word the moment she helped cut the steering cable on my sunboat. I told her she was never a part of my family and she was never a mother to that boy. I told her exactly what she was. "You are a parasite," I said, my words cutting through her sobs like a razor blade. "You tried to attach yourself to my bloodline and drain us completely dry. You thought you could feed off my son's legacy and leave me with nothing but empty grief." She stared at me, her breath hitching in her throat. The realization finally settled entirely over her broken mind. She realized that she had never fooled me for a single second. She realized that I had orchestrated every single detail of her downfall. I stood up perfectly straight and delivered the final absolute blow. I told her that parasites only survive when the host does not know they are there. "But I knew you were there, Chloe," I said smoothly, "and I just exterminated you." I turned my back on her without waiting for a response. I did not need to hear her cry anymore. I walked back toward my attorney, Vaughn. Agent Miller pulled Chloe roughly toward the door, her legs dragging behind her as she continued to sob hysterically. The second agent hauled Trent up from the floor, pushing him forcefully out of the dingy office. The trap was completely empty now. The pests had been removed. I looked around the quiet room, feeling the heavy air begin to clear. The checkmate was absolute and final. 3 months after laying my only son to rest, I visited the lake house I built for him. The lights were on. I thought it was trespassers. But when I bypassed the changed security gate and checked the hidden cameras I installed years ago, I was shocked by what I saw. The people inside were not strangers. And the conversation I overheard altered everything I thought I knew about my son's death. I am Malcolm Reed, 75 years old, and this is the story of how I destroyed the people who thought they could bury my bloodline and steal my legacy. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light no matter how deep someone tries to hide it. Agent Miller grabbed Chloe by her arms and began to turn her toward the door. She was stumbling, her feet slipping on the cheap carpet of the notary office. She was completely broken, a sobbing mess of a woman who had just watched her entire future turn to ash. But I was not finished. A master contractor knows that a demolition is not complete until every single piece of rubble is cleared away from the foundation. I took a step forward and raised my right hand. I looked at the federal agent and asked him for one more minute. I told him there was one final piece of business that I needed to clarify with my daughter-in-law before she was taken away to a concrete cell. Agent Miller nodded slowly. He held Chloe firmly in place, keeping her facing me. Chloe looked up at me with tears streaming down her pale face. Her mascara was completely ruined, running in dark streaks across her cheeks. For a brief, pathetic second, a look of desperate hope flashed in her eyes. Her sociopathic mind actually thought I was going to show her mercy. She thought the frail old grandfather she had manipulated for months was going to step in and stop the federal agents. She opened her mouth and whimpered my name. She begged me to help her. She reminded me about the $5 million. She cried that the money was legally hers and that it had already cleared her checking account that very morning. She begged me to let her keep the money so she could take care of little Miles. I stood perfectly still, letting her pathetic pleas echo in the small room. I looked at her with an expression of absolute freezing coldness. I told her to stop talking and listen very closely because I was only going to explain this to her once. I told her that she had spent the last 3 months planning a brilliant financial scheme. I told her I knew exactly how it felt when she opened her banking application on her phone this morning and saw those massive zeros sitting in her account. I told her she probably felt like a genius. She probably thought she had outsmarted the water patrol, the insurance company, and a grieving old man. I told her she thought she had successfully traded my son life for a lifetime of luxury. Then I leaned in closer so she could hear every single syllable clearly. I told her that she was an amateur playing a game designed by experts. I asked her if she had ever heard of a legal concept called the Slayer Statute. The confusion on her face was immediate. She stopped crying for a fraction of a second and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. I explained the law to her in simple, brutal terms. I told her that the Slayer Statute is a very real, very strict law in the United States. I told her that the law prevents a murderer from inheriting any property or financial benefits from their victim. I explained that because she and Trent were legally implicated in causing the death of the insured person, who was my son Andre, she was permanently and legally barred from receiving a single cent of his life insurance policy. Chloe began to shake her head violently. She stammered and sputtered, insisting that the money was already in her personal bank account. She cried that the insurance company had already approved the claim and sent the wire transfer. She said it was too late for the law to stop her because she already possessed the funds. My corporate attorney, Vaughn, stepped forward and stood right beside me. He looked at Chloe with the cold, professional detachment of a man who dismantles fraudulent companies for a living. Vaughn explained the reality of her situation. He told her that I had deliberately expedited the $5 million payout. He told her I had personally called the insurance company to ensure the money dropped into her account today. He explained that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been monitoring her account in real time. The very second that $5 million wire transfer crossed state lines and landed in her bank account, the federal agents froze her entire financial portfolio. Vaughn told her that the money she thought she had this morning was nothing but digital bait. He explained that it was a controlled delivery coordinated between the federal government and the insurance fraud division. I watched the absolute devastation wash over Chloe's face. She realized that I had handed her the money intentionally just so the federal agents could lock her in a federal trap. She never actually had the money. She was just holding it for a few hours before the steel jaws snapped shut around her wrists. But I was not done. I wanted her to understand the absolute totality of her financial ruin. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her that federal prosecutors do not just freeze stolen funds. I explained that she was currently facing charges for first-degree murder, racketeering, and federal wire fraud. I told her that defending herself against those massive charges would require a team of highly expensive defense attorneys. I watched her swallow hard, realizing that she needed money to fight the federal government. Then I delivered the crushing blow. I told her she had absolutely no money left to hire a lawyer. I explained that in order to pay for restitution for the massive civil lawsuits I was about to file against her and for the criminal penalties associated with insurance fraud, the government was seizing every single personal asset she had to her name. I told her they were seizing her personal checking accounts, her savings accounts, and her investment portfolios. I told her they were going to repossess her luxury vehicles and confiscate the expensive jewelry she had purchased using my son's hard-earned money. I told her she was going to be assigned an overworked public defender because she was officially completely and absolutely destitute. Chloe's legs gave out. If Agent Miller had not been holding her up by her arms, she would have collapsed onto the dirty carpet. She let out a long, agonizing wail that sounded like a dying animal. She screamed that she was going to lose everything. She cried that she had nothing left. She sobbed that it was entirely unfair and that she was being robbed. I did not show a single ounce of pity. I told her she had not lost everything yet. I told her there was one final piece of the demolition. I asked her what she thought was going to happen to all that money once the federal government reclaimed it from her frozen accounts. I told her that the $5 million life insurance payout and the liquidated value of every single personal asset she owned was being legally routed directly into an impenetrable blind trust. I told her that this massive trust fund was established specifically for the sole benefit of my 10-year-old grandson Miles. I leaned in so close she could feel the heat of my anger. I told her that I was the exclusive controller and sole trustee of that fund. I told her that I would personally manage every single penny of that money to ensure Miles grew up with the absolute best education and the most secure future possible. I told her that she would never be allowed to touch a single dime of that money for the rest of her miserable life. And more importantly, I told her she would never see Miles again. I explained that because she was going to a federal penitentiary for the premeditated murder of his father, I was being granted full, uncontested, permanent custody of my grandson. I told her I was going to completely cut off her toxic, enabling parents from the boy life. I told her that Miles would grow up knowing exactly what kind of monster his mother truly was. The sheer weight of her total destruction finally broke her completely. Chloe threw her head back and screamed a horrible, guttural scream of absolute despair. She thrashed against the federal agent, crying and begging and pleading for a mercy she did not deserve. She realized she had traded her entire life, her freedom, her wealth, and her only child for a pathetic, failed murder plot. She had nothing. She was nothing. Agent Miller did not wait for her to calm down. He roughly pulled her toward the heavy wooden doors of the notary office. The second agent was already dragging Trent out into the cold Chicago morning. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room and watched them drag her away. Chloe kept screaming my name, begging me to stop them, crying that she was sorry and that she had made a terrible mistake. I did not blink. I did not look away. I watched the door swing shut behind her, cutting off her pathetic cries. The dingy office was suddenly very quiet. The corrupt notary public was still sitting behind his desk, weeping silently into his hands, knowing his own arrest was imminent. The female insurance fraud investigator gathered the massive stack of fraudulent documents and placed them securely into her briefcase. My corporate attorney, Vaughn, stepped up beside me and placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He told me that the job was done and that the foundation was completely cleared. I took a deep, slow breath of the stale office air. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. I had promised my murdered son that I would protect his legacy and secure his child future. I had promised myself that the people who took him from me would experience the absolute darkest depths of human ruin. I had used my patience, my intellect, and the cold, hard reality of the law to crush them into dust. I was a master contractor, and I had just completed the most important demolition of my entire life. I turned away from the door, ready to go home and tell my grandson that he was finally safe. The days following the arrests in that dingy notary office were a chaotic whirlwind of federal indictments and massive media frenzy. The local news stations in Chicago quickly caught wind of the incredible story. A highly successful local businessman murdered by his own trusted partner and his deceitful wife. The shocking headlines were everywhere, plastered across newspapers and morning television screens. I kept my doors firmly locked and focused entirely on my 10-year-old grandson, Miles. I had to sit a young, innocent boy down and explain that his mother was not coming home ever again. I did not give him the gruesome, agonizing details of the murder, but I told him the absolute truth. I told him that she broke the law and had to go away for a very long time. It broke my heart to see the heavy tears well up in his eyes, but I held him tight against my chest. I promised him he would always be safe with me. I told him I would never let anyone hurt him again. I became his permanent shield against a dark and greedy world. Meanwhile, inside the cold, damp concrete walls of the federal holding facility, the arrogant alliance between Chloe and Trent completely disintegrated. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among murderers facing the rest of their natural lives behind thick steel bars. The federal prosecutors applied maximum pressure. They placed them in separate interrogation rooms and let the crushing weight of the federal justice system do its heavy work. Trent broke first. His expensive defense attorney immediately contacted the United States Attorney Office begging for any kind of plea deal. Trent tried to claim that the entire murder was Chloe doing. He told the federal agents that she was a manipulative mastermind who seduced him and begged him to tamper with the boat steering cable. He claimed he was just a foolish pawn in her deadly game, blinded by her manipulation and her promises of extreme wealth. But Chloe was not going down quietly. Her overworked public defender fired back with a desperate counter-narrative. She claimed that Trent was a violent, aggressive man who forced her into absolute compliance. She told the federal prosecutors that Trent threatened to kill her and little Miles if she did not go along with the insurance fraud and the real estate theft. They were two drowning rats trying to stand on each other's shoulders just to keep their heads above the freezing water. They pointed fingers, they cried, and they lied through their teeth. But the federal agents did not care about their pathetic blame game. The high-definition video evidence showed them both laughing, drinking vintage champagne, and openly celebrating my son's death. They were equally guilty, and the federal government intended to bury them both in the exact same grave. The federal trial did not last very long at all. When you have a confession recorded in crisp 4,000 pixel resolution and a highly documented trail of interstate wire fraud, the defense attorneys have absolutely nothing to work with. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom every single day wearing my best tailored suit. I wanted them to see my face every single time they looked back toward the gallery. I wanted them to remember the master contractor who built the inescapable cage they were currently locked inside. Chloe looked terrible. The intense stress of federal incarceration had stripped away all her fake, glamorous charm. Her blonde hair was dull and unwashed, and her posture was completely defeated. Trent looked like a hollow, empty shell of the arrogant businessman he used to be. He kept his eyes glued to the defense table, too cowardly to look at the jury or at me. The federal prosecutor presented the case flawlessly. They played the hidden camera video for the jury, letting the sound of Trent bragging echo through the large courtroom. They showed the forged debt ledgers Chloe had emailed across state lines, proving the federal wire fraud. They brought in the corrupt doctor who had attempted to diagnose me with dementia, showing exactly how Chloe had bribed him to steal my estate. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the foreperson stood up and read the verdict, the courtroom was completely silent. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of federal wire fraud, guilty of first-degree insurance fraud. The federal judge did not show a single ounce of mercy. He looked down at them from his high wooden bench and delivered a speech that I will remember for the rest of my life. He called their actions a sickening display of pure, unadulterated greed. He told them that they had violated the most sacred bonds of human trust just to line their pockets with bloody money. Then he brought down the heavy wooden gavel. He sentenced both Chloe and Trent to life in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. There would be no early release for good behavior. There would be no second chances or appeals. They were going to die behind cold steel bars wearing cheap prison uniforms until they took their final breaths. The demolition of their lives was officially complete. But my final battle was not fought in a criminal court. It was fought in family court. Chloe, toxic, enabling parents flew all the way from Oregon to Chicago. They hired a sleazy family law attorney and tried to petition the court for emergency custody of my grandson Miles. They walked into the courthouse acting incredibly entitled, demanding that the boy be handed over to them so they could take him back to the West Coast. They had despised my son Andre from the very beginning. They always thought their daughter was too good for a hard-working black man who built his wealth with his bare hands. I knew that if they took Miles, they would spend the rest of their lives poisoning his mind against his father's memory. They would try to erase his heritage and teach him to hate the very foundation of his own family. I was not about to let that happen. My corporate attorney, Vaughn, joined me in the family court hearing. We did not even need to argue aggressively. We simply presented the certified federal conviction of their daughter. We demonstrated that Chloe had actively attempted to steal my entire estate and leave my grandson completely homeless just to fund her escape to an offshore paradise with her lover. We showed the judge how Chloe was willing to use Miles as a cheap bargaining chip to force me into signing away my house. The family court judge looked at Chloe's parents with absolute disgust. He told them that their daughter was a convicted murderer and a federal fraudster who had permanently forfeited her rights as a mother. He denied their custody petition entirely and threw their case out of his courtroom without a second thought. The judge granted me full, uncontested legal and physical custody of Miles. I stood outside the courtroom doors and waited for Chloe's parents to walk out into the hallway. When they emerged, I blocked their path. I looked them dead in the eyes with the cold, lethal determination of a man who had just destroyed a criminal empire. I told them to get on a plane back to Oregon and never contact my grandson again. I told them that if they ever set foot in the state of Illinois or tried to send him a single letter, I would use my immense wealth to bury them in civil litigation until they were totally bankrupt. They looked into my eyes and they saw the absolute truth. They saw the architect of their daughter's destruction. They saw a man who would burn the world down to protect his bloodline. They turned away without saying a single word and walked quickly out of the building. I drove home that afternoon feeling a profound sense of closure. The long, brutal demolition was finally over. The rotten structures had been completely torn down and the toxic debris had been cleared away. I walked through the front door of my Chicago home and listened to the quiet, peaceful sounds of my house. I went into the living room where Miles was sitting on the rug playing with his favorite toy trucks. He looked up at me and smiled that same bright, beautiful smile that his father used to have. I sat down on the leather sofa and watched him play, feeling the warmth return to my heart. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. We still had a lot of healing to do and a lot of heavy grief to process over the coming years. But we were going to do it together. I had protected my bloodline against the ultimate evil. I had secured my son's legacy and made sure his killers paid the ultimate price. I had ensured that the massive fortune Andre worked so hard to build would only be used to give his son a perfect future. The foundation of our family was finally strong again, and nobody would ever threaten my house again. 3 months have passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut on the people who murdered my son. Today, the air in Wisconsin feels completely different. I am standing on the sprawling wooden deck of the lake house at Lake Geneva. The sun is just beginning to set over the deep, dark water, casting a brilliant golden and crimson light across the surface. The sky is painted in rich, beautiful shades of orange and deep purple. For a very long time, I could not even look at this vast body of water without feeling a massive, crushing weight in my chest. It felt like a crime scene. It was the terrible place where my only child took his final breath in the freezing dark. But that dark shadow has been permanently lifted. I absolutely refuse to let 2 greedy sociopaths take this beautiful sanctuary away from my family. I built this house from the ground up with my own 2 hands, and today it is officially a safe home once again. Beside me, standing right on the edge of the sturdy dock, is my 10-year-old grandson, Miles. He is wearing a thick, warm winter jacket and holding a simple fishing rod in his small hands. The chilly wind is biting at our faces, but neither of us seems to mind the cold. I reach out and place my large, calloused right hand over his small fingers, gently adjusting his tight grip on the reel. I tell him to keep his elbow tucked in closely to his side and to keep his eyes locked firmly on the distant horizon. I am teaching him exactly how to cast the fishing line, just like I taught his father Andre 40 years ago on a different quiet lake down in Illinois. When Miles pulls his arm back and sends the shiny lure flying out over the rippling water, I see a perfect, flawless reflection of my son. He has Andre's strong shoulders and his quiet, unwavering determination. When the young boy smiles, the entire broken world feels right again. He does not ask about his mother anymore. He knows she made terrible choices and went away, and he knows he is completely safe with me. We do not talk about the darkness today. We only talk about the water, the fish, and our bright future together. I look out across the vast open expanse of the lake and let my mind wander back over the brutal legal war of the last few months. A lot of people in my Chicago neighborhood looked at me differently after the shocking news broke on the television. They whispered quietly about the retired contractor who orchestrated a massive federal takedown of his own daughter-in-law. Some of them thought I was acting out of pure blind vengeance, but they do not understand the focused mind of a master builder. Vengeance is a messy, chaotic, and destructive thing. Vengeance is a heavy sledgehammer swinging wildly in the dark, breaking everything it touches and leaving a pile of useless rubble. I did not want wild vengeance. I wanted absolute surgical justice. I wanted to completely extract the toxic cancer from my family tree without damaging the healthy, strong roots. I wanted a legally binding destruction that left zero room for appeals or lenient parole boards. Chloe and Trent genuinely thought they had committed the perfect crime. They truly believed they could murder a good, honest man, steal a $5 million life insurance policy, and sell off a multi-million-dollar private estate, while I sat in a leather armchair weeping into a white handkerchief. They looked at my gray hair and my wrinkled hands, and they only saw pathetic weakness. They completely failed to realize that the deep wrinkles on my hands came from decades of moving heavy steel beams and pouring thousands of tons of concrete. They failed to understand that a man who spends his entire life reading complex architectural blueprints knows exactly how to map out a total structural collapse. I let them build their arrogant little tower of lies, and then I calmly and methodically removed the primary load-bearing pillars. Now they are wearing cheap, scratchy prison uniforms, eating terrible food, and staring at blank gray concrete walls for the rest of their natural lives. They have absolutely nothing left. The $5 million that Chloe tried to steal was seized by the federal government and securely routed into an impenetrable blind trust. Every single penny of that money is now safely generating high interest for Miles. When he turns 25 years old, he will inherit a massive financial empire that will guarantee his children and his grandchildren will never have to struggle for anything. I protected my bloodline against a lethal threat. I secured my son's honorable legacy. I made absolutely sure that the immense wealth Andre worked so incredibly hard to build stayed exactly where it belonged. I watch Miles slowly reel in his line, his young face twisting into a look of deep, serious concentration. I step back and give him some room to work, letting him figure out the tension on the reel entirely by himself. Being a grandfather is the absolute greatest privilege of my long life, but being a fierce protector is my ultimate duty. I am 75 years old and my old bones certainly ache when the weather turns cold. But standing here on this solid wooden dock, breathing in the fresh evening air, I feel much stronger than I have in decades. The heavy fog of grief will always linger in the quiet, empty moments. I will always deeply miss Andre. I will always wish he was standing right here next to us, showing his growing boy how to properly bait the hook. But the agonizing pain of his betrayal has been completely erased by the clean finality of the justice we achieved. The sun finally dips below the distant tree line, throwing long, dark shadows across the peaceful property. The automated security lights I installed along the stone pathway flicker to life, bathing the entire house in a warm, protective yellow glow. I put my heavy hand on my grandson's shoulder and tell him it is time to head inside for a hot dinner. He smiles up at me and nods, carrying his fishing rod proudly by his side. We walk up the wooden stairs together, leaving the dark, freezing water behind us. I look at the sturdy, thick walls of the lake house and feel a profound sense of absolute, lasting peace. I built this foundation to last 100 years and no storm is ever going to tear it down. They thought I was just an old man waiting to die. But they forgot I am a builder, and I always make sure the trash gets taken out before I finish the job. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true power does not roar in the heat of anger, but waits patiently in the absolute silence of calculation. People blinded by greed will always mistake silence for weakness and old age for ignorance. They will eagerly build their own traps if you simply hand them the tools and step back to watch. Revenge is a chaotic fire that burns everything it touches, but justice is a meticulously constructed building with a foundation of undeniable truth. You must protect your legacy, not with loud threats, but with quiet, ironclad actions that leave your enemies absolutely nowhere to run. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below so we can continue building a strong community together.